when I look at the framework of biblical scholarship, um, how the Book of Mormon came to be, I mean, it's interesting. The Book of Mormon text is interesting, but that doesn't change the message and the theology of the text. I mean, it doesn't change that there's backdated prophecies in it. It doesn't change that it's founded on the literal historicity of the stories and characters of the Pentateuch. It doesn't change that it's based on 19th century theology that was in Joseph's milieu, and that the prophecies in the Book of Mormon that are post 1829 are either false prophecies, in my view, or they're very generalistic prophecies that would apply to any time and place.
Mormonism with the Murph, where Larry Singh explores church history and the church's truth claims. Hello everyone, welcome back to my channel, Mormonism with the Murph, where Larry Singh explores the church's history and the church's truth claims. And I'm really excited for today's episode. I have with me guest Anthony Miller. Anthony, thanks for joining me.
Thanks for having me. Thanks so much.
Yeah, so I've been doing a series on the Book of Mormon. I've been diving into some of the things to do with the historicity of the Book of Mormon, looking at apologetics and what critics have to say. Diving into like textual anachronisms and possible sources and the translation process. And I've also had the opportunity to interview different scholars like Brian Hales, Brent Gardner, Stephen Smoot, Blake Ostler on the expansionist theory, and they've shared sort of like their evidence or their case why they see the Book of Mormon as historical and the authenticity and responding to some of the issues or things that critics bring up. And in this series, I'm trying to be fair and objective, and I also want to hear from people who have different perspectives or different theories or critics. And Anthony Miller, you released a video a couple of months ago on Facebook of your sort of theory of how you believe the Book of Mormon could have been composed and orally dictated, if not by inspiration or the gift and power of God, sort of a secular naturalistic explanation for it, which I found very thoughtful, really well reasoned. I was quite impressed with it. If I were to stop believing, lose my faith, I think that's what I would go for. And I thought, hey, bring you on, we should have a chat about it.
I appreciate that. I mean, in the video, I expressed that I'm somewhat agnostic as to the degree to which God could have been in the process. So it's not.
You still leave room for possible inspiration and.
Yeah. Although the meaning that I attribute to inspiration is probably different than an Orthodox believer, but
sure.
But yeah. Thanks. I appreciate that compliment on that. And what we've talked about is that I'll comment or share some of those things in that video in this episode today, and so the viewer and the listener can see what I was talking about.
Yeah, and I think it's good to hear other people's perspectives as I'm on my faith journey and exploring these truth claims. I want to look at sort of the theories and the things that critics bring up, and to explore their perspectives. And I'm sort of questioning and challenging my own beliefs, and I think that can be a good thing. And trying to have epistemic humility as we're doing this. And I've read Dan Vogel or William Davis and their sort of, or Grant Palmer, their explanations for the Book of Mormon, which I think are very reasonable and really understandable. And I think I appreciated that yours was quite thoughtful and trying to incorporate also some of maybe the complexities in the Book of Mormon as well. But before we dive into the Book of Mormon, tell any of my listeners a little bit about you, a little bit about your background with the church, sort of your faith journey. You went through a faith crisis and left the church, and just a little bit about your role in the post-Mormon community, and a little bit about your YouTube channel.
Oh, thanks. Yeah, so my ancestors are all Mennonite. They were part of the early Anabaptist movement in Germany and Switzerland. And
I actually met a Mennonite going from the MTC to my mission. I'd never heard of them before. Yeah. Well, that's kind of cool.
Yeah, so the Anabaptist movement includes people like my family, that they were really conservative. They drive dark colored vehicles. They didn't wear very much jewelry. Dancing was forbidden. The joke was, you know, why premarital sex is forbidden is because it could lead to dancing, you know, was one of the jokes. But there are other Anabaptists that there was kind of a split in the past where the Amish are part of the Anabaptist movement, and they chose to not adopt modern technology and conveniences. And so everybody, you know, probably is aware of what Amish are. And then there are Hutterites, which is kind of a hybrid in terms of how much they accept modern technologies, but they tend to not have private ownership of anything, and they live in colonies where the colony owns everything, and they have like a common mess hall where they eat. And uh, all of these groups of the Anabaptist movement do have a propensity to be very entrepreneurial. And so things like the mobile home industry and the RV industry was heavily developed by people in the Midwest who were Anabaptist, Mennonite, Amish. A lot of the tradespeople who build RVs are Amish that get picked up, you know, from their community and then taken to the manufacturing facility in Elkhart, Indiana, where those things are built. Anyway, that's a big tangent, but Anabaptists were conscientious objectors, nonviolent people. They were anti-slavery since the 1600s in a Protestant movement, and they felt like individuals should be able to have cognitive capacity before they were baptized. So generally, you know, they didn't baptize infants. People were baptized when they were teenagers or adults or whatnot. So all my ancestors are Mennonite, with many. My mother's father was the equivalent of a general authority in the Mennonite church. He was on the welfare board. He had a radio show. He was in charge of all the seminaries and institutes in the Eastern United States and in Canada. And then on my father's side, my grandfather was very charitably inclined and a very successful business owner, built a business that was an organic chicken business and a chick hatchery. So my parents joined the church, the LDS church, when I was 3 years old in Phoenix, Arizona. We moved there for health reasons. And my father has ADD type tendencies to the extent that he wasn't generally able to provide financially for us very consistently, but the church helped him. And when my parents eventually divorced, when I was a teenager, the church really provided significant support for my mother, me, and my three younger siblings. And the church became a very, very significant part of my life. It gave me father figures. It gave me an opportunity to go serve a mission. I served my mission in Barcelona, Spain. I learned on my mission how to do better at studying, you know, because I had to learn Spanish, and I learned how to navigate some of my ADD tendencies, my competitive nature, you know, just kind of almost in my DNA to be an entrepreneur, was expanded when I was a missionary. And so my mission was a very helpful and good experience for me. The church was completely enmeshed in my sense of identity. I came home from my mission and got a bachelor's in Spanish, and then and a master's of business administration, and ended up building a career in financial services. So I've been in financial services for 32 years. We have 5 staff people and 2 other associates in our office. We serve thousands of households. And I am academically inclined. I taught upper division finance at our local college for 7 years as well. So my whole life was completely enmeshed in the church. I loved the church. Growing up in the church was super helpful. I plan to be able to retire at this point in my life so I could go serve missions for the rest of my life.
Yes, you
That's
told me that off air.
yeah, that's how I interpreted my patriarchal blessing. And I served in ward and state callings, uh, was a temple ordinance worker and so forth. So um, the year that we would become empty nesters was about 7 years ago. And actually it's 7 years ago this month. And because I'm so analytical over the years, when I would encounter disconfirming information to how I attributed meanings to my spiritual experiences. So like, I think like most people, we are taught that when we experience spiritual experiences, that represents a reliable divine source to determine objective truth. So if
Hmm.
we read a scriptural text and we experience spirit with it, that is the Holy Ghost testifying of the truthfulness of that thing. And many times we have a propensity to interpret it as that means it's a literal historical thing written by a literal historical person, and almost documentary history of how it's presented in the passages. Sometimes it's, interpreted with more nuance, but the main thing was my spiritual experiences were so significant and frequent that I knew it was completely enmeshed in my identity that the church was true. So when I would encounter difficult information that was disconfirming or caused me dissonance, a little bit more than 20 years ago, there was a BYU professor by the name of Richard Hotsoppel. He has subsequently, I think, been called to be a General Authority 70. He presented to our stake in a fireside the idea of the shelf, where if you encountered difficult information or information, he didn't use the word dissonance, but it was disconfirming information. What you would do is you would, in faith, set that thing aside as if a metaphorical book on a shelf, in faith that God would provide you further light and knowledge about it someday. And sometimes, every now and then, you would suspend dealing with that issue, and you would come across an answer. And so maybe you would be able to take one of those books off the shelf and not have
Yeah.
to worry about that one anymore. But the way my mind works is being analytical, just loving to delve into information. I accumulated lots of things on my shelf. In fact, maybe I had a metaphorical wall full of shelves of disconfirming or dissonance causing information. But the meanings that I attributed my spiritual experiences were so enmeshed in my identity, so strong, that I knew the church was true. And that allowed me to leave those things on my shelf. So what happened about 7 years ago is our then 22-year-old son came out to us as gay, and I believed the doctrine of the church with regard to LGBTQ issues, but I also had been what you would call a social libertarian for a very long time. I believe it wasn't the role of government to control what we did in our private lives, whether it was our faith or whether my neighbor decided to live in a same-sex marriage.
Yeah.
So philosophically, politically, I was like, the article of faith about, let everybody worship how they want. Like I was that kind of believing Mormon
Mm.
and leaned social libertarian. And so our son came out to us as gay, and what I couldn't do at that point is shelf for him the idea that God would want him to live a life completely absent the kinds of comprehensive love and connection that my wife and I share. And I didn't believe that he would be able to experience that in a mixed orientation marriage uh, with a woman, and that would be, I would never want for my daughter for her to be in a mixed orientation marriage with a gay man. That wouldn't be fair for
Yeah.
her. That wouldn't be my desire. And so I didn't know what to do with that. And so the evening of April 29th, 2016, I went online searching for resources as to how a believer could support a gay son while not believing that God would want him to live a life completely absent comprehensive intimacy and love. And somehow, I don't know how, I don't know how it happened. That evening, I stumbled across the gospel topics essays on the church's website, and I had never heard about them. They weren't talked about in our ward. I don't ever remember seeing a press release about them or anything. And I stumbled across the gospel topics essays, and that evening, I consumed them. And the analytical person that I am is that as I consume the essays, I read the footnotes, and then I would, if there were links in the footnotes, I would go to the link in the footnotes to try to make sense of what was in the essay and what the writers of the essays were trying to extract or express from the cited sources. And as I read the essays, there are a few things that happened. One was I recognized that I taught things from lesson manuals and read things, testimonies from the brethren and things like that, and had spiritual experiences about them that were contrary to the information that was in the gospel topics essays. And so my my framework that spiritual experiences represented reliable divine witnesses of truth, like that caused a huge crack to my shelf in those moments as I was reading it. And also, as I read the essays and I read the footnotes, it seemed to me, at least, that in some cases, what was in the footnotes wasn't being represented in the essay. And in particular, it was in the race and the priesthood essay with footnote 9, where it leads the reader to believe that Brigham Young prophesied about 1978 and he would have supported it because they pull a partial phrase saying, that someday that blacks would receive all the blessings of the priesthood and more. And I had never heard that, of all the years, I was 49 at the time, of all the years that I had, gone to seminary, institute, took BYU religion classes, taught gospel doctrine when I was high priest group leader teaching classes. I had never heard anything like that. So I went to the link in the cited sources and I read Brigham Young's 1852 speeches where he announces legal slavery in Utah, and where actually he teaches in the February 1852 when he teaches blood atonement, he teaches Adam God, he teaches all these disavowed things in that speech. And he also seems to represent the idea that at the end of the millennium, after the restitution of all things, and everybody's been resurrected, and after all, he says all the sons of Abel, which could mean all white people or all people who would have been born, literally descended from Abel, that didn't get to live because Cain killed Abel. But basically, after all the sons of Abel had first received the opportunity of the priesthood, then blacks would receive the priesthood, all the opportunities of the priesthood and more, and the curse would be taken from them. And in the talk, it seemed like he was talking about features of people who are black, like with wide noses and so forth. And it seemed like what he was saying in that speech was the curse would be taken from them, and that included not only the priesthood, but that their features would be changed and they would become white. It seems like that what he was saying. So when I was reading that, I came to the conclusion myself that the brethren who had taught and testified of the truthfulness and the divine nature of the ban, or defended the ban, the reasons for the ban, as well as the idea that the ban was from God, and Brigham Young teaching these things, the conclusion that I came to is that not only had my spiritual experiences corresponded with partially or entirely inaccurate things, but the same thing happened for the brethren too, and that they didn't really fully have the capacity to discern between their own biases and prejudices and actual inspiration from God. And not everyone that reads that comes to the same conclusion, but that was my experience as I was reading them. And it was so traumatic when I came to that conclusion, recognition for myself, and with regard to the brethren and the trust that I had in the brethren, was that is the thing that crashed all my shelves.
Yeah.
And so all the decades of things that were dissonance causing or disconfirming information that I just really couldn't reconcile, that I had set aside, they all crashed. And that was so traumatic for my soul, and the enmeshment of my identity with God and spiritual experiences, that in those moments I felt like heavens closed, and that God ceased to exist, like he never existed in the first place. and in my TED talk, I explain, notwithstanding my cries out to him in those moments. So that's what put me in faith crisis. And my dark night of the soul period, where I was crying myself to sleep and all that kind of stuff. I couldn't find anyone locally who had read the essays. None of my leaders had any answers for me. And they really did the best they could, but by the time I was counseling with them, the weeks and months that followed, there was such a huge knowledge gap because I was consuming large volumes of information to try to make sense
Yeah.
of what I had discovered. And in the end, it wasn't apologetics, it was support communities for people that have gone through faith crisis that helped me heal from the grief and the trauma and so forth. So to cut the story short, is that over the years, participating in the Salt Lake City Sunstone Symposium, participating in Mormon Spectrum, or now they're often called Thrive support groups, were instrumental in my healing. I ended up in a mixed faith marriage because my wife remains an active believer in the church. Um, and and kind of how I'm built, as well as a sense of importance of kind of what goes around comes around, and giving back to the community. I began participating in podcasts as a guest in 2019. So I was on Gina Colvin's A Thoughtful Faith. I shared my Mormon Stories story in August of 2019. I was on Infants on Thrones with Glenn Ostlin. And over the years, I've been on Mormon Stories more than a dozen times. I've been on Mormon Discussion podcast. We did a series where we covered all but two of the essays, but me, Bill Reel, Alan Mount, and then periodic guests, we would read through the essays word for word and then discuss our individual experiences with the essays. I did that. I've been on Britt Hartley's Almost Awakened podcast that is part of the Mormon Discussion podcast.
Yeah.
And so we did like a book club type series about Jack Kornfield's book, Buddhism for Beginners, as well as Brian McLaren's Faith After Doubt book as well. So my local support group that I created and now I co-lead, about 20% of the group are nuanced believing members of the church that still go to church, and we support them in that without an agenda of where their faith journey will end. And the approach that I take is I try to be thoughtful in my discussions and seek to understand where people are coming from. And so in the end, I decided within the last year that I wanted to do my own podcast. And so I recently launched it. It's called Life After Deconstruction.
Yes.
I don't have a huge amount of content there, but I have some, in the queue. And with your permission, I'll include what we're
Yes.
recording as one of my episodes as well, where
Definitely.
I want to talk about what do we do after we have gone through the deconstruction process. Deconstruction, the meaning that I'm attributing to deconstruction is a process of unpacking meaning to try to understand where things came from, what do the words mean in the scriptures, where do the narratives with regard to truth claims and things like that, where do those things come from? How do human myths, by myths I don't mean like just a fake story, but like a connecting narrative that unites people together, how do those develop? So once a person has gone through the work of processing grief or trauma of a faith crisis, and they've gone through work of deconstruction, what do they do next in their life moving forward with
How
that?
they reconstruct and build
Yeah,
and healing
yeah.
and growth after a faith crisis.
Yeah. So those are the conversations that are really interesting to me. So the majority of what I do is not deconstructive in nature,
Mhm.
although the conversation that we'll have in this part one recording will be more deconstructive in nature. But I hope to share my ideas thoughtfully with regard to the Book of Mormon and scripture and how it was created and how I still find value in the text, even though I don't believe it is what it represents what the common narratives are with regard to
Sure.
it. So that's a long introduction about me and where I come from and what I do and why I'm grateful to participate in this discussion with you today.
No, that was great. And I think I'll link also in the description your interviews and other podcasts if you want to know more about your story, listen to your Mormon Stories interview. And I remember, I've listened to it, I think a couple of times, maybe not every single episode. I know I listened to them all at least once. And, I remember just mourned with you, just kind of, I felt your pain, felt your, sincerity. And, it's real, the pain people go through in a faith crisis. And, so yeah, I'm excited for this discussion. We're thinking of making part two, focusing more on sort of healing and growth after a faith crisis and sort of like community and also navigating a mixed faith marriage and also relationships. I'll probably talk a little about how we can have civil dialogue and conversations and build bridges versus trying to tear and attack. But
Sure.
so we're going to
I,
talk about, oh, go ahead.
yeah. So I would say one thing, I alluded to it, but for the listener and the reader, if you don't want to watch or listen to my 6+ hour Mormon Stories interview, I share a good part of my story in a TEDx talk that I gave last year.
Yes.
So it's like 6 hours worth of material in less than 18 minutes. So you'll link it, but you can find it by Googling Anthony Miller TEDx talk. And I share my TED talk. The name of it is Thriving and Building Community After a Faith Crisis. And I only use the word Mormon in the very first sentence because what I found is existential crisis, faith crisis is more ubiquitous beyond just people of the Latter-day Saint faith
Yes.
having
All
experienced it.
religions. Yeah.
Yeah, people
Brilliant.
experience existential crisis. So the listener and reader can find that there too.
Awesome. So we're going to talk a little bit about the Book of Mormon and Anthony's sort of theory and view and how the Book of Mormon was composed. The believing, traditional narrative is that it was translated from gold plates, either using the Urim and Thummim or seer stone, and that Joseph Smith translated by the gift and power of God. That this is an ancient historical text. That there are Nephites and Lamanites, whether you believe in a hemispheric or limited geography models apologists are moving towards, but that it came by inspiration, revelation. That's where the text came from. And if you're not a believer, then the big question can be, how did he orally dictate this 531 page book in 85 days? So I'd like you to talk a little bit about sort of your view on sort of like the mechanics of the Book of Mormon dictation, the time frame, where you think the inspiration and sources and ideas came for the Book of Mormon composition. So I'll let you take it away, and I'll interject if I have any questions or anything to do with apologetics. But you take it away.
All right. Thank you very much. So what I start with is when I went through my faith crisis and faith deconstruction, I focused initially on church history issues because it was the essays that kind of triggered it.
Yeah.
And
First
then,
vision, polygamy, black
yeah,
priesthood. Yeah.
all those issues. Yeah. Yeah. Women in priesthood, DNA,
Which are
things like
important.
that.
But you could say the Book of Mormon, it's, we refer to it as the keystone of our religion. Like it's foundational, like everything rises or falls on, the authenticity, and I would argue the historicity of the Book of Mormon. I know there's some maybe more progressive believers that may not believe in historicity, but that it still holds spiritual value and it's still true in a spiritual sense. But I think that there's tangible truth claims, with the Book of
Yeah.
Mormon.
Yeah, I mean, certainly there are people who experience spirit with it and still find it as a scriptural text, but they've
Yes,
renegotiated how they attribute meaning to it.
sure.
Uh, yeah, even though if they don't believe in literal historicity. So, the second thing that I did is after several months of deconstructing, reading dozens of books, the business that I'm in, the last 3-4 months of the year are my crunch time where I'm doing year-end tax planning and cash flow planning and things like that for clients. But having my faith crisis beginning on April 29th was fortunate because, May to September are typically lighter months for me. So I was able to consume dozens and dozens of books and large volumes of information to be able to process things. And after I got to a certain point of deconstructing church history, the next thing that I moved to was the study of biblical scholarship and world history as it relates to religion and spiritual belief and so forth. And I started with Bart Ehrman's Misquoting Jesus, and then from there spent quite a bit of time. And actually, it's still quite a significant interest to me. The most recent book that I read is John Barton's The History of the Bible. So biblical scholarship is very, very interesting to me. And so to put into context my sense with regard to how the Book of Mormon came to be and what it is, I'd start by explaining what I've learned and what I understand about biblical scholarship, certainly disclosing that I'm not a biblical scholar. This is just
Yeah, me neither.
from what I've read. So the
Okay.
first thing that I learned is that the texts in the scriptures, uh, when the writers write the texts, what they're doing is they're expressing their theological, political, philosophical, and rhetorical goals and concerns in the specific time, context, and place and circumstances in which the writer is writing, or the redactor if the writer is taking different pieces and gathering them together. So I would say, for example, when President Nelson gives a general conference talk today, what he's doing is expressing his theological, political, philosophical, and rhetorical goals and concerns about what is happening today, or perhaps what he perceives might happen in the very near future.
Sure.
And so then
So
now
that from Joseph Smith, isn't Revelation adapted to the circumstances of the children of men? That
yeah,
sort of thing.
his concerns in his day. So what I would say is that when President Nelson gives a talk, his talk is recorded, video, audio, and transcribed into writing. And what I would say is that if someone 500 years from now in the future, it's hard to imagine 500 years in the future, but like imagine 500 years in the future. If someone 500 years in the future read one of President Nelson's talks today, and they perceived that the themes and concerns expressed in the talk really resembled and gave meaning to the experiences that person was having 500 years in the future, um, and particularly if they experienced a sense of spirit with the talk, they very well may perceive that President Nelson's talk was intended to be a direct prophecy about that person's day 500 years in the future.
Right. Yeah.
And that makes sense that could happen. And even though they might negotiate and interpret President Nelson's talk as if it were intended to be direct revelation, it actually never was intended to be a direct prophecy about what happens 5 years in the future. And then what that person might end up doing is when they write or express or give a talk about what's happening in their day, what they might do is pull the themes from President Nelson's talk and enmesh it in theirs, so that if later, 500 years after that, someone read that person's talk or writing, they would go, oh, see, President Nelson 1,000 years ago taught this. 500 years ago, his prophecy was fulfilled because look at the writing of this person 500 years ago that uses all of these themes and language and imagery. So that is evidence of the fulfillment of the direct intended prophecy of President Nelson 1,000 years ago. So are you following what I'm saying?
Think so.
Makes
Think
sense.
so.
Makes sense. So my understanding is that most texts that we have in scriptures are like this, where the writer is really focusing on what their concern is about their day. So most biblical scholars would explain, for example, the New Testament text of Revelation was about the theological, political, philosophical, and rhetorical concerns in the time period in which that text was written. So like 666 is referring to Nero, and the other imagery and things in the book Revelation are expressions of the writer about the concerns in their time. And then since that, because people have a propensity for an apocalyptic type of view from time to time, there are people in the centuries that followed the writing of the book Revelation that perceived that that text was intended to be a direct prophecy about their time. So, when I was young and I joined my parents joined the church when I was 3 in 1969. In the 70s, the rhetoric was that the book Revelation was intended to be a direct prophecy about what was happening in the 70s. And when I
Hmm.
was in college in the 80s, I had friends that were uh, totally convinced that the book Revelation was directly intended to prophesy about what was happening in the 80s with the Cold War and all
Yeah.
those kinds of
Everyone
things.
thinks
And
the signs of the times and the second coming's happening in their
yeah,
generation.
yeah. So what happens is people read the book Revelation, they see the imagery, they perceive what's going on, and then they apply it to themselves. We're taught to apply the scriptures. They apply
Hmm.
it to
Like in them.
themselves, liken it to themselves, but then their perception is that that text, written maybe at the end of the first century CE, was actually intended to be a direct prophecy about our day. But biblical scholars would say that that is not the case. And
Hmm.
biblical scholars, including BYU scholar Joseph Spencer, uh, would explain that the same things happened in the texts in the Bible uh, of the texts that are attributed to Isaiah. So for example, whoever wrote First Isaiah, whoever wrote the portions of Isaiah that were written during and after the Babylonian exile, they were expressing the concerns about their day, and some pretty significant imagery, like the one of the wounded servant, being bruised and things like that.
Yeah.
And then centuries and centuries later, uh, at the time of Jesus may have perceived that the themes from Isaiah were related to his messianic role or purpose. And then in the decades after Jesus passed away, the writers of the text that ended up being what we have in the Gospels, um, in particular Matthew, but in the other texts, what they did is they drew from themes in Isaiah and then imputed them to Jesus as if they were direct
Prophecy.
manifestations of
Mhm.
prophecy, right?
Yeah.
And so this was a common understanding. And Christians, when they read what we call the Old Testament, or that's the Hebrew Bible, they'll say, I see Jesus all over the place in the Old Testament as direct prophecy. See, because if you read the Old Testament and you read the New Testament, there's evidence there that all these were all direct prophecies and they were fulfilled in Jesus.
Yeah.
Like, why can't the Jews see that? And
Hmm.
Jews will read their Hebrew Bible and they'll go, no, that they were talking about what was happening in their time, and the New Testament writers are just, proof texting or drawing from this imagery that's in Isaiah or Ezekiel, and then they're imputing it on Jesus. And it's very well possible that Jesus saw or perceived that Isaiah was, the words of Isaiah were about him. But certainly the writers of the text that ended up in the New Testament perceived that. So
It
Joseph
kind of reminds me
Spencer.
of as a missionary, whenever I would have used passages like in Ezekiel about, the stick of Ephraim and the stick of Judah, and the interpretation being that, it's the Bible and the Book of Mormon, and, they go hand in hand together, and that's a prophecy. And that wouldn't align with, the way biblical scholars would interpret that, or what the meaning was. You could say it's been maybe actualized, or it's appropriate. There could still be that interpretation one could draw, but that maybe wasn't the meaning of the author when they wrote that.
Yeah. So a common apologetic, I mean, one apologetic is to try to hold to the idea that those texts or writers were intending to express direct prophecy. Just like a future apologist could say, President Nelson's talk, 500 years in the past was intended to be a direct prophecy about what would happen 500 years later. Then there are other apologetic approaches that say, well, revelation and prophecy is cyclical. So yeah, they might have been talking about their time, but the way that God expresses things is that it's multi-purposed, these
Yes, sure.
texts, right? So that's another apologetic reconciliation. But what you'll find, what I found is, and what I understand is the majority of biblical scholars will say, no, actually what's happening is people express their concerns about what's happening in their time. And then later people read those things, they find meaning, maybe they experience spirit with it, and then they impute meaning to that as if under the idea that it was intended to be a direct prophecy
Mm.
about their day. So, so the second thing about biblical scholarship is, if we want to better understand scriptural texts, it's helpful to better understand the context and the concerns that existed in the time that the text was either written or added to, redacted, or in the Book of Mormon case, narrated. It was the method of transmission. So with regard to the Book of Mormon, a really strong example of that is 2 Nephi 25:23, which includes the phrase, "For we know it is by grace that we are saved after all we can do." So at the time that Joseph Smith narrated the text of the Book of Mormon to Oliver, the phrase "after all we can do" meant despite all we can do. So we're
Yes, I've heard
saved
that
by
as an
grace.
apologetic defense because a lot of evangelicals and Protestants would cite that scripture being like, that goes against, you believe works will save you. It's after
Yeah.
everything you do.
Yeah, but it's not, it doesn't mean, scholars have researched this and looked at dozens and dozens, maybe hundreds of examples of the usage of "after all we can do" in the late 17th century or late 18th century, early 19th
Yes.
century, before and after 1829. And they haven't been able to find one case where the phrase meant "once we have first exhausted all our efforts,"
Yes,
right?
yeah.
So we have this tendency, and Protestants who criticize members of the church or the Book of Mormon say it doesn't make sense to say we're saved by grace once we have first exhausted all our efforts. And the truth of the matter is, if we want to understand scriptures, we need to understand what the usage of the words were, and it meant
Yes.
despite
In
all
its
we can do.
historical time and context. And I think a lot of members of the church would use that to defend, oh, it's after everything we do, exhausting all our efforts, us
Yeah,
after we do everything in our power to be righteous, then we're saved. And a lot of people misinterpret that verse, both
yeah,
people, evangelical Protestants and also, believers as well. And it's important to
yeah.
know what was the meaning when it was being dictated at that time.
Exactly. And so that's why biblical scholars like Dr. Dan McClellan is a biblical scholar. He's launched a podcast called Data Over Dogma, has a popular TikTok channel. What he's expressed, and other biblical scholars have expressed, is that if we really want to understand the Book of Mormon, we need to study it as if it were a 19th century text, um, as either the narrator or the translator was expressing phrasing, symbols, and concerns in a 19th century context. And this
Yes.
example of 2 Nephi 25:23 is a really great example of that. That if we really want to understand the text of the Book of Mormon, it needs to really be placed in a 19th century context. Um,
Yes.
um, and later on, we'll talk about how Blake Ostler reconciles this, which his and Mike Ash's, I think, are probably the best apologetic
Like a 19th
reconciliations.
century translation of an ancient text. But yeah, it's important to understand the 19th century elements, the phraseology, the King James
Yeah,
Bible, that it's Joseph's vocabulary.
yeah, exactly. So the third thing that I'd reference with regard to biblical scholarship is that there are moments in texts where there actually is prophecy, right? So and where there are prophecies in texts that we find in scriptures that are really specific, and they're prophecies that were made in the past and then they came true, what biblical scholars will tell you is that those are backdated prophecies that are composed pseudepigraphically. So pseudepigrapha is an example of pseudepigrapha is writing in someone else's name as if it were from that person, not necessarily to commit fraud, but to
Hmm.
express that person's rhetorical, theological, and otherwise concerns and goals, and then attribute it to somebody in the past, almost as honoring them
Yeah.
in the past. So that's what pseudepigrapha is. So where there is prophecy, what biblical scholarship would say is where there is prophecy that's really specific and it comes true, that those are backdated prophecies where people are writing much later after things have happened and then placing it back in time as if it were intended to be a direct prophecy. And then what we tend to find is that as we get closer and closer to the period of time in the text in which the text was actually composed, written, or narrated, then what tends to happen is the prophecies get more and more general and less specific.
Right.
And then when they are prophecies about what would happen after the text is composed, written, or narrated, if they're specific, they're most often incorrect. They don't happen. Or they're general. So like if you have a general prophecy that there's secret combinations of men and, things like that, that's a general prophecy that is ubiquitous in the history of humanity. There have always been, you know, uh, conspiracies and evil
Hmm.
designing people who take oaths to to conspire together. And so what sometimes people do is they'll look and they'll see a generalized prophecy and they'll say, well, see, it's true because it's prophesying that it happened this day. But really what that was is a generalized prophecy that exists in all times. So an
And
example
I
in
think you
biblical,
can see that. Oh, sorry, I was going to say you can see that as well. In the Book of Mormon, some of the prophecies, and it could be very specific about quoting that Mary is going to be the mother of Jesus, and John the
yeah,
Baptist baptizing Jesus, or Christopher Columbus discovering the Americas, and a critical reader, historian, scholar might say, like, okay, this would be a prophecy if it was Nephi writing this, or Moroni, but is this just Joseph Smith attributing it
is this
back?
backdated? Yeah.
Yeah, the specificity.
The Book of Mormon is so specific that it has this idea that Joseph of Egypt knew about or prophesied about Joseph Smith, and that Joseph Smith's dad's name would be Joseph Smith. I mean,
Yeah, I
it's
think that's
that level of
secondly by three. Hmm.
specificity, right? Yeah. So in the Bible, an example of this is the Book of Daniel in the Old Testament. So the Book of Daniel is a pseudepigraphic apocalyptic text written as if it were specific narratives and prophecies of a literal historical Daniel that lived around the time of the exile in the 6th century BCE, and then prophecies about the future. And what you have in the book of Daniel is all those prophecies that are very specific are fulfilled up until around 170 BCE. And then around 167 BCE, the prophecies turn out to be, more generalized. And then when they're specific, they're wrong. And so that's how biblical scholars know when the book of Daniel was written. It was written around 167 BCE. And where there were specific prophecies, they were actually backdated prophecies about things that had already happened. So the prophecy about the stone cut without hands, from the mountain that rolls, and that was a backdated prophecy about what already had happened. Um, uh, that was included in the book of Daniel. The book of Daniel is actually the very latest book written that we have in the Old Testament. It's not placed at the end. Malachi is placed at the end, but the book of Daniel is actually the very latest written book. And so, in any event, so you bring that up as an example with the Book of Mormon, where the prophecies, as they approach 1829, they tend to get more general. And then after 1829, the prophecies are either really generalized, like there'll be oaths and secrets and combining men, or they're prophecies where they're specific, they're wrong. So like one of the prophecies in the Book of Mormon is that the literal lineal descendants of the Lamanites would unite with the righteous Gentiles, and that they would like decimate and wipe clean the earth of the unrighteous Gentiles. So that didn't happen, right? And I mean, there are probably some people that probably think that
Maybe it's
still
still good.
yeah, the Mormons are going to not conspire. They're going to join with all the people who live on Indian reservations, and then like take up their arms and slaughter all the unrighteous Gentiles. But that seems that wouldn't work, because there are like drones and stuff. So that seems very unlike. Seems to be a false prophecy that lets us know when the Book of Mormon was. In the similar way that we know when the Book of Daniel was written, or another prophecy in the Book of Mormon talks about the seed of the literal lineal descendants of the Lamanites blossoming like a rose. And I remember I had friends that served in South America, and I perceived that the growth of the church in South America, at the time that I was serving, was a manifestation of blossoming like a rose. But what we've subsequently learned is there were things like baseball baptisms, and a lot of the growth that happened in South America really wasn't real growth. The retention was low, things like that. And indigenous Americans were, subsequent to the writing before and then subsequent to the writing of the Book of Mormon, they were decimated in the United States. Some tribes had more than 90% of their tribe die or get killed, and so there are real legitimate concerns, that indigenous Americans in North America have. And so the narrative that they were going to blossom like a rose doesn't seem to have been an, a fulfilled prophecy, depending on the meaning that you attribute to blossoming like a rose. So there are those, and there are other prophecies in the Book of Mormon that, similar to the Book of Daniel, could give people an idea of when the text was actually composed or narrated. But again, like I mentioned, Blake Ostler, Mike Ash's co-authorship, reconciliation, they maybe have a way of dealing with that from a faithful standpoint.
Mm-hmm.
So the fourth thing that I would share with regard what I learned from biblical scholarship is that the idea or the existence of a biblical canon was a very, very, very late development that didn't happen until many, many centuries after texts were written and redacted. So most people, at least tangentially know that the New Testament texts, or the text that ended up in the New Testament, and debates maybe even they might know with regard to whether or not to include the book Revelation in the text, those weren't settled until 300 to 400 or even later CE. And so this idea that the writers of the Gospels, or that the letters actually authored or co-authored by Paul, or the pseudepigraphic letters falsely attributed to Paul that were written in his name, the idea that those writers knew that what they were writing was going to be part of a biblical canon, that's kind of a no-go from a biblical scholarship standpoint. And the same thing is true of the scriptures that are in the Hebrew Bible, or what we call the Old Testament, is those were really not comprised in what you would call a compiled biblical canon, like a single text where you have all the scrolls, attached together. That didn't happen until centuries and centuries after those texts were written. And so there's this perception. It mainly comes, I think, out of Protestant ideas with regard to sola scriptura and how the biblical canon to be. There's this idea that the Bible is univocal, like it's God, up here, and he's expressing to humans almost like a fax machine, or using humans as sock puppets.
Infallible, inerrant word.
Yeah, to say all these things with the idea that the whole Bible is univocal from God, instead of human beings experiencing spirit or a sense of divinity, and then imputing up to God characteristics, desires, as if God was narrating directly to them, like the fax machine or the sock puppet idea. But what it was is individuals writing their perceptions, their theological concerns, philosophical and whatever rhetorical goals, imputing up to God meanings that they found helpful. And that's why when you read the Bible, you'll see that there are a lot of contradictory things. Like there's two different creation narratives that are contradictory.
Sure.
There's two different nativity narratives that are contradictory. The Luke one and the Matthew one are contradictory.
Like who
Um,
appears at the tomb, after Jesus' resurrection, or
the resurrection narratives are
yeah.
contradictory, because it's not univocal God communicating, like fax machine. It's human beings. Pete Enns, a biblical scholar, Pete Enns says that scriptures are human beings writing what they perceive God would have them write, as if God was actually narrating it to them, kind of
Yeah.
thing. And because human beings were limited by our vocabulary, by our conceptualizations, our paradigms, our history, our tribe, or whatever, we fallibly express things with what we have available to us.
Mhm.
And that over time, all these different texts, uh, not it's probably fair to say none of the people who wrote any of the texts that are in the Bible had any conceptualization that they would be part of a biblical canon that was considered univocal, like that.
Right. That's not the way they viewed scripture, that it was inerrant at
Exactly.
the time. Yeah, that's kind
Yeah.
of a Protestant notion. That's how I grew up. I imagine it might have been similar for you. Very literalistic and fundamentalist. That yeah, scripture it's direct from the mouth of God. Especially the Book of Mormon and Revelations, and they're writing word for word, kind of like facts from
Yeah.
God, and that's probably an incorrect view of scripture and revelation, even if you still want to believe that there's some inspiration behind it, but it's them attributing to God. Similar to, I think, when you're writing in a journal and you're recording events and spiritual impressions and experiences, and there's probably more similarities to that, to what biblical authors were doing.
Yeah. Yeah. I agree with that. So I shared these four things with context of the implications for restoration scripture. Because my perception is that Joseph Smith, his conceptualization of scripture was that it was literal history.
Hmm.
What was that if there are errors, they were copy errors, not original writing errors. And so he believed, like, that the Exodus was a literal historical event. He believed that Adam was more than an ideological myth, about creation.
Hmm.
And Joseph Smith was approaching things again with this conceptualization that not only is the Bible literal history, and to a certain extent, there is a version of univocality with the idea that God is much more active in dictating or narrating what would end up in the text, is that he also approached things with this idea that it was understood, uh, from before the Babylonian exile, at least, and probably even before that. Joseph Smith's conceptualization was that it was understood that this was all going to be a Bible, like that all these texts were going to be aggregated together in, a single book, uh, and so forth. And so when Joseph Smith, narrated the Book of Mormon, when he narrated the books of Abraham and Moses, when he expressed when he narrated revelations that ended up in the Doctrine and Covenants, he was doing this through the conceptual framework that the writers of these biblical texts knew that this was going to be a book for
Right.
today. So we have you have in the Book of Mormon, we have the prophecy that in the latter days we'd say a Bible. Everybody's got a
Yeah, that's
Bible,
also
but
what sprung to my mind.
yeah, yeah, there was absolutely no conceptualization of a Bible uh, until centuries and centuries later, after that is placed in time. That revelation is placed in time, and biblical scholars would say that that almost certainly not was there a completed 5 books attributed to Moses, uh, compiled together in 5 books until after the Babylonian exile.
Hmm.
So, so,
So like
so,
500-600 BCE,
uh, yeah,
probably the consensus.
so the Babylonian exile, I think, was over around 538 BCE, and many biblical scholars think that the Pentateuch, or the 5 books attributed to Moses, probably didn't reach the form that we recognize them until maybe the 400s even.
Hmm. Okay.
And there are scholars who argue earlier. I'm just sharing what I understand to be more of the consensus of scholars. With the Book of Mormon, there's the narrative that there are brass plates that have the 5 books of Moses plus other pre-exilic texts, supposedly including all of the writings attributed to Isaiah, at least first and second Isaiah, into a compiled book that is the brass plates, that is kind of like a Bible, you
Hmm.
know.
Like
But
a codex. Yeah, it's got like
yeah,
a lot of the Old Testament books in it.
yeah. But biblical scholars would say that that doesn't make any sense, right?
Hmm.
So again, this has implications for my view. It has implications for restoration scripture, because restoration scripture was expressed through the conceptualizations that Joseph had, and he had these conceptualizations that in many ways are contrary to these 4 things that I just shared, and they affected what the content of restoration scriptures were. But then also, like I've alluded, there are scholars uh, like Mike, or apologists like Mike Ash and Blake Ostler, who accept at least some of the things that I've shared.
Yes.
Blake Ostler still believes in direct prophecy. In your episode with him, he talked about, he's very quite certain that Isaiah was, including second Isaiah, was intended to be direct prophecy about Jesus. And he talks about hints or shadows of the wounded servant showing up in other texts in the Old Testament, as if it was like known that there was direct prophecy about Jesus. But at the same time, he probably agrees with several of the things that I shared as well, while holding this nuanced view about intentional direct prophecy. And then, so he would say, yeah, it totally makes sense if Joseph had a worldview and a conceptualization that's contrary to these 4 things that I shared, that
Sure.
he would express the Book of Mormon. And Blake would say that it could have come from an ancient text, but Joseph Smith was adding explanations, including 19th century material, including King James Version material, including other material based on his conceptualized framework that is contrary to the 4 things that I just shared. So I know that was kind of long to go through before we
No,
get to
that's
the
a
really
good background though. Before going, I think we can touch on maybe some of the things with historicity. We kind of laid it out there, but we'll talk maybe historicity after you talk about your theory of sort of
okay.
composition and dictation.
All right. Thanks for your
That's good
patience.
background on biblical scholarship because it's an area that I don't have expertise in. It's definitely a topic I want to explore and tackle on this channel. I think it's an important one because it's foundational. You could say that everything builds off, and it's something that a lot of members of the church and Christians aren't aware of biblical scholarship, and it's
Yeah.
important about the critical elements, which could be hard, but to have a better understanding about it.
Yeah. Yeah, I highly recommend John Barton's History of the Bible. And then there's the Robert Alter translation of the Hebrew Bible. And then there's the Oxford the New Oxford Annotated Bible, which is a good study Bible with regard uh, to be able to cover Old and New Testament kinds of things. So in any event,
Also,
uh,
maybe we'll bring you back for a future episode and dive deeper, maybe into biblical scholarship and the Old Testament and the New Testament, because it seems like that's a topic you're knowledgeable about and quite passionate about.
yeah,
That
I'm certainly not a biblical scholar, but it's something I'm very interested in. So I've read, dozens of books related to it. So, all right. So I'll get into my sense of things. So as I understand it, Joseph narrated or orated to his scribes the rough equivalent of an average cumulative word count that would equate to about 90 minutes per day if the process lasted 85 days. And it probably took an average, because what would throttle the production of the Book of Mormon is how fast Oliver could
right.
handwrite as a scribe. And so the average word count, if it were 85 days, would equate to about 3 hours per day cumulative handwriting. Now, there are ideas that the Book of Mormon was done in 65 days.
Yes,
So
I've
that
heard that
would
number.
Right. And so that would equate to
2069.
that would equate to 4 hours a day instead of 3 hours a day.
And some days
Uh,
it could have been more, some days could have been less. We
yeah,
don't exactly.
that just be
That's
the
not rough
average.
average. Yeah.
Yeah. So those days of the narration of the Book of Mormon, or the oration of the Book of Mormon, were described as long, quote, long and arduous days, which would seem to mean that those 3 hours, maybe on average, maybe 4 hours of transcription, were spread over 10, 12-hour days or more. And that would lead me to conclude that there were probably frequent breaks during the process each day,
Mhm.
which would give Joseph time to pray and ponder, read his Bible for inspiration, refer to other texts, maybe even the Adam Clarke commentary, which includes the King James Bible plus commentary. Similar to this, Bible includes the text of the Bible plus commentary, although the Adam Clarke commentary is a lot bigger. Or refer to sermons of Joseph's day, or to refer to other texts for his pondering and ideas. So, so I would say, I mean, there's accounts that there were breaks where maybe they would go out and do manual labor, or they would skip rocks. There's the account of them taking in part of the 116 pages portion of it. There's an account of eyewitness account where Martin Harris tries to switch the brown
Stones. Hmm.
stone for a different brown stone, which would lead me to believe that there was a process of narration or dictation, and then they took a break and they went out. And so that gave Martin Harris an opportunity then to like switch,
Aye.
to test Joseph, kind of thing. So, so so my sense is that the maybe 3 hours of transcription was spread over a much longer period of time, which included being able to go ponder, pray, and access uh, ideas or information, or seek inspiration, praying and stuff like that during the day. So there are eyewitness accounts. As I understand the eyewitness accounts, is they are largely have to do with the 116 pages, as opposed to the, spread equally over the 65 or 85 days. But there are eyewitness accounts that suggest that Joseph didn't use other materials at all in the process.
Yes, like the quote from Emma Smith saying that there was it no notes or manuscripts he had.
Yeah,
I was
yeah,
going to bring up because you were saying that the possibility there could have been Adam Clark's commentary, there could have been perhaps sermons. I know apologists would say there's not evidence that he had all those books. What would be your quick response to that? Possibly there could have been a King James Bible there.
yeah.
We'll
So,
touch on that when you talk about the King James Bible because some apologists would say, well, none of the witnesses said he had a King James Bible open, and surely they would have been like, what are you doing with the King James Bible open? But
Yeah. So I would say two things. I would say the textual evidence makes it clear that something like that happened. Even if witness accounts don't refer to it, or even if Emma's very, very late account, toward the end of her life, that said that Joseph, couldn't write a well worded letter, which we know is not true because we have letters from Joseph that are well worded, and we have sections of the D&C where he narrated sections of the D&C that were very well worded. So we know that that's not true.
they're
That he,
downplaying his intelligence and
yeah,
his
yeah,
abilities.
yeah. And so so let's see. So in any event, I would say I would say I would say a couple things. So one thing that I would say is um, BYU professor Thomas Wayment and one of his students did a study to look for intertextuality or direct borrowing with the Clark commentary and the Joseph Smith translation.
Yeah.
And they found more than, I think, more than 100 instances of sufficient attachment that there was direct borrowing,
Mhm.
and some critics or former members, think that this means that that he was just copying directly from the Clark commentary. That's not what the study was. The study was looking at instances of direct borrowing where maybe Joseph was doing it, and then he would refer to the Clark commentary sometimes and sometimes not. But there were
Mhm.
enough connections that they believe that it's clear
There's a
that
dependence on
that he was
borrowing.
doing that. So there are no eyewitness accounts, nobody that said, hey, when Joseph was doing the Joseph Smith translation of the Bible, he was periodically referring to the Adam Clark commentary, right?
Mhm.
There's no eyewitness accounts that say that, but the textual evidence is that he was uh,
Yes.
using that, and I think the evidence that we have of the text of the Book of Mormon is stronger than Emma very late in her life saying he never referred to anything, or uh, other witnesses saying not. They didn't say necessarily that he wasn't. They just didn't include testimonies saying, well, during a 10 or 12-hour day, where they accumulatively were scribing 3 hours, he sometimes took breaks during the day to read his Bible, ponder, pray,
Mhm.
you know, and stuff like that.
Because it's unquestionable that there's King James Bible phraseology and long chapters and quotes from the King James Bible. Like faithful scholars acknowledge that. If you look at the Isaiah chapters or the Sermon on the Mount, there's a dependence upon the King James Bible, and there's some scholars that might think he must have, when he got to the Isaiah chapters, had the Bible open and was reading from it. Some faithful scholars might believe that perhaps the words appeared, through revelation to his mind, and then he was free to, veer from it, or maybe God just chose to reveal it on the stone. As a naturalist or a critic, you could either believe that he had a Bible open, or he would have had an extremely good memory and was able to sort of fluently recite or dictate from the Bible. I find that hard to imagine he would have, with the long chapters of Isaiah and the Sermon on the Mount, but you could maybe make that theory or speculation that he could have just been, if no Bible was present, he could have just had it near memorized or fluently dictated.
Yeah, one example of this, you just did an episode on the long ending of Mark, and there are examples of Joseph saying the long ending of Mark, uh, or narrating it to a letter. So, like at the very least, with
Yeah.
those examples, he memorized the long ending of Mark, right? The other thing is you have to remember is that in Joseph's day, it was common for the King James Bible to be an educational text, particularly for people who were homeschooled. And they didn't have television or podcasts.
Such a
So
pity.
right. And so they and so it was common for people to study the Bible and memorize large portions of it.
Mhm.
If I recall correctly, someone could correct me if this is inaccurate. If I recall correctly, Martin Harris talked about his abilities having memorized long sections of text
Yes, I know the quote you're on
in the
about.
Bible.
Yes.
And so it was common that day, but I don't think that Joseph needed to memorize super long portions, because I think if there were 3-4 hours a day of transcription done over an 11, 12, 14-hour day, that there would have been breaks. And I'll get into that a little bit more in a little bit. But I,
Mhm.
I think the textual evidence is stronger than witnesses saying that Emma saying that he didn't refer to anything, or witnesses not saying that he referred to
Yeah,
things.
I think it's quite apparent that there weren't notes. Some people thought maybe he put notes inside the hat or he had a secret manuscript. I think you would probably, I would think, I don't think there's evidence or a case for that, but you could say that perhaps a Bible, perhaps other things.
Yeah, yeah. Let me get into that
Sorry, you keep
a little
going.
bit.
You keep going.
Yeah. Okay. So I think most of the narration was more of an oral sermon performative type thing that
Hmm.
was common to the method of exhortation in Joseph's day. And he would have seen this kind of thing and even been partially trained to do so when he was on the Methodist Sunday school rolls and attended camp meetings. When he was on the Methodist Sunday school rolls, he was participating in training to be an exhorter, so he was learning this method.
That's
um
interesting. The word "I exhort you" is actually because I've been reading the Book of Mormon again, and it's throughout the Book of Mormon. I exhort you, and believer apology. They could say, well, that's just because he's the translator, it's his vocabulary. But it's interesting that that word "exhort" is throughout the Book of Mormon, and that you had Methodist exhorters, and he would have been involved in that.
yeah, so Bill Davis uh wrote, as a comment on a video that I did, he said the majority of the sermons in the Book of Mormon, from Nephi to Moroni, all derive from a common style and format of sermonizing that originated among the medieval scholastics known as Sermo Modernus. The Sermo Modernus didn't exist when any of the Nephite prophets were supposed to have existed.
You have to
Uh,
explain that for me.
so so the Sermo Modernus was where they would have an outline of, and I refer to this. Bill Davis talks about the oral sermon approaches of
Like the laying down
laying down
head.
heads,
Yeah. Okay. Got
as
you.
material for an orator to cover in a sermon. And the Book of Mormon text actually directly refers to this practice of laying down heads, which connects into this performative sermon type of process that was developed in medieval times, is when it was developed. Now, could it,
Right.
it,
With
it
the
ex-
at the
existed
beginning
before
of
then?
books, at the beginning, yeah, because I think because I was hoping to have an interview with William Davis. I know some apologists would point to, in some ancient writings they might have had like a wee outline beforehand, but yes, in the Book of Mormon, like before First Nephi, there's this sort of paragraph of sort of like the outline of what basically is going to happen in the book, like a sketch outline. And I know he talks about in his book that that's almost like the outline that he would have had if you believe Joseph the author dictated that. So he had a rough outline that he was working from. He wasn't just making it up on the fly.
Yeah. Yeah. So he had thoughts or ideas in his mind. And then what Bill would explain in his book, and what I noticed as well, is, as I've studied the history and the topic, is many of the sermons where characters in the Book of Mormon are giving a sermon, they look very close to the sermons of Joseph's day.
Yeah, like a
You know, John,
revival preacher.
a revival, Jonathan Edwards sermons, things like that. And so now, like I said, Blake Ostler could say, well, maybe he was drawing from an old text, but expressing it in such a way that related to his day. You know, that's what a
Yeah,
translator would do.
yeah, to his
That
19th
would be,
century audience and his vocabulary.
yeah, yeah, that would be the faithful reconciliation. The more naturalistic explanation would be Joseph is, you know, like I mentioned, Pete Enns suggests that scripture represents human beings writing what they think God would tell them to write,
Yeah,
as if God was actually sock puppet narrating to them, but what they're doing is actually imputing up to God. And so using, if Pete Enns' idea of scripture, if that's accurate, that Joseph is doing a similar thing where he is expressing ideas, theology, stuff like that, imputing it up to God as if, you know, as if it's coming directly down from God, but he's using the language of his day to do
right.
that. So I want to share Doctrine and Covenants 9, because I think it seems to give insight of some of what Joseph Smith did in the
Mhm.
narration process.
Go
So
for
if you
it.
remember, Doctrine and Covenants section 9 is the Lord speaking through Joseph Smith to Oliver after Oliver attempted to use his dowsing or divining rod
Yes.
as a focusing device to translate. I'm thinking in a similar way that Joseph used his brown stone as a focusing or a performative scrying device. So D&C 9 that we have today isn't actually the original narrated text of the Revelation. It was changed a little bit because the original Revelation refers to Oliver's divining rod.
Funny
But
thing
that was
about that
taken out.
revelation, I remember as a missionary, it was a passage I really like because it talked about, receiving revelation in your heart and in your mind. And I remember reading about it, I think it's referred to as the gift of Aaron in the Doctrine and
Yeah,
Covenants. I was like, oh, gift of Aaron, like kind of like a spokesperson. But then it talks about like you'll hold it in your hands and it's told you many things. I'm like, wait, what? I'm like, what the heck is the gift of
yeah,
Aaron? And then I didn't realize in the Book of Commandments it was referring to the divining rod or yeah, gift of
yeah.
the
Yeah, and so there has been an attempt over time with subsequent use of terminology, editing of revelations that were in the Book of Commandments to to edit out references to the folklore magic and the
yeah.
scrying of Joseph's day.
Yeah, referring to like
Um,
the seer stones, the Urim and Thummim, or yeah,
yeah, yeah,
rod to the gift of Aaron.
yeah, right. So I want to read DNC 9 because I think it's relevant. So this is the Lord speaking to Oliver in the current version of the revelation that we have. The Lord
It's
says,
interesting.
"Behold." Go
I'm
ahead.
just gonna note that we often read the scripture about how revelation works, and when you're talking about scripture and the context. The context is Oliver Cowdery trying to translate the book more with his divining rod. And often we read those passages and it's like, okay, this is how you receive revelation. It's interesting that, and that could still be applicable, but it's interesting that's the context of what's going on here.
Yeah, yeah, yes, absolutely. And this is the Dan Vogel first. I first saw this pointed out from Dan Vogel with regard to this section. So the Lord speaking to Oliver saying, "Behold, you have not understood. You have supposed that I would give it to you when you took no thought, save it was to ask me. But behold, I say unto you that you must study it out in your mind, and then you must ask me if it be right. And if it be right, I will cause your bosom to burn within you. Therefore, you shall feel it is right. But if it be not right, you shall have no such feelings, but you shall have a stupor of thought that shall cause you to forget the thing which is wrong. Therefore, you cannot write that which is, excuse me, that which is sacred, save it be given you from me. Now, if you had known this, you could have translated. Nevertheless, it is not expedient that you should translate now. So, so this section of the Doctrine and Covenants, I think, would correspond to Joseph taking breaks from the narration to do these things:
Hmm.
ponder, pray, study. And Joseph would have seen, or Oliver would have seen Joseph do these things. And so whether or not the process was Joseph was doing this, uh, as it's shown right here in this section of the D&C. He'd take breaks, he'd ponder, he'd pray, he'd read his scriptures, he'd read sermons, he'd feel a burning in his bosom, and then he'd come back and narrate to Oliver what the text was, or whether it's a more naturalistic thing, uh, that that he was modeling to Oliver what is expressed here, even though it wasn't
That's his
happening that way
method.
for him.
Yeah,
Yeah. Either way, my sense is that Oliver believed this is what was happening.
right.
That Joseph was pondering and praying in his heart, uh, thinking about it, and then he would feel a burning in his bosom, and that would give him confirmation of the words to say to Oliver. So I think if we could go back in time and witness it, I think that it's likely that what the scripture says is how Oliver perceived Joseph was doing it,
Right.
because this is how Oliver would have done it.
Right,
Does that
gotcha.
make sense?
Because we have the accounts of, some of the witnesses like Martin Harris, David Whitmer, Emma Smith that point to it being more of a tight translation. He was reading it word for word. The character would appear, then the
Yeah.
sentence, he would just dictate it. And, D&C 9 could be more of the accurate explanation for how he was doing it,
More
in
of a, it's more loose. Yeah.
yeah, more loose, studying out in his mind, pondering it. You could still say it was, inspiration, or you could just believe the naturalistic explanation that he was just coming up with this. And maybe he sincerely believed that this is, God was approving of it. He was receiving revelation and then dictating that way. So it didn't just come to him or appear on the stone.
Exactly. And I would say that, my sense is this again goes to my premise that the text, uh, strongly indicates, and I think stronger than what the witnesses say, that outside materials would have been, referenced at some point during these 12 to however long the long and arduous days were, that breaks, or before, during, or after the cumulative 3 to 4 hours a day of transcription, they would have seen Joseph do what is in D&C 9. And maybe they would have perceived that, it was Joseph, seeking inspiration, pondering, praying, reading, studying. Uh, and so they didn't think, oh, he was just copying the long ending of Mark, or he
Mhm.
was taking this single phrase, that only appears one time in the Book of Mormon, that he takes from the Book of Matthew and sticks it into the narrative as, more as direct borrowing of that phrase. They
And you
probably
could also
didn't
say that
perceive
Joseph
that.
is, yeah, and you could also say that Joseph either intentionally or unintentionally, like subconsciously, is in his oral dictation is interweaving some New Testament phrases. I think there's obvious times where it's intentional, whether or not you believe it's him clothing the translation or him just, dictating, taking from the Bible. But there's wee phrases which maybe unintentionally, just sort of like in the way that preachers would talk. I've done it, where I've, given a talk at church and you use sort of language, but I don't know where I'm quoting from. It's not me intentionally, but it's, all these phrases that you hear.
Yeah, someone in the southern states of the United States, when talking about how nervous somebody is, they might say hanging on like a cat on a screen door, or as busy as a cat on a hot tin roof.
Mm.
And they would be familiar with that phrasing, and so they would include it in their conversation. And it seems clear that Joseph, he studied the Bible, he was familiar with the language, and that he inserted phrasing, including in some cases what you as a teacher, an academic, or me when I taught, uh, if I read one of my students' essays at the end of the semester, when I taught upper division finance, if there were specific phrasing that was directly borrowed, from a public company's 13F filing, then I would know that the student is borrowing from that, putting it in the essay, but I would be able to see whether or not they were referencing it or citing it as a source.
Right. Yeah.
Right. So, so what I'm explaining so far still uh, allows for either a naturalistic explanation or an inspiring uh, idea. I think
Like
if it's
Luther
an
translation.
inspiring idea, it's the Pete Enns model, where it's Joseph, it senses an inspiration and he speaks as if God were actually narrating to him. Uh, and Blake Ostler, Mike Ash would say, well, it's more the authorship thing where Joseph is receiving inspiration from God, but it's more of like an impression rather than a fax machine. And that Joseph then is using the words, the vocabulary, the things in his milieu of his day to express something. And that would be the apologetic
And
reconciliation.
you gave to me a similar analogy of your experience. I don't know if you're going to touch on it whenever you
Yeah,
were
I could do
missionary
that.
in
Yeah.
Spain, how you
Yeah.
received impressions, but you had to clothe them in Spanish.
Yeah, I served my mission in Barcelona, Spain. And one thing that I recognized is when I was giving blessings or performing an ordinance like confirming person a member of the church and saying receive the Holy Ghost, um, I would receive I would feel like I received impressions, but they weren't clothed in language. And that I was then left to try to express the impression in the vocabulary of Spanish that I had to the person I was giving the blessing. Now, sometimes I perceived that I was receiving a direct word or a direct phrase, but more often than not, my experience giving a blessing in Spanish was I felt like I received an expression. It wasn't clothed in language, and that I had to then express it in the vocabulary that I had in Spanish to the person
Yeah,
I was giving the blessing to. And they very might well have thought that the words that I was saying were God fax machining through me
you're the puppet.
um, as a sock puppet, but that's not what was happening. I was sensing impressions that didn't have language. It was really weird to me, but I
Mm,
think this is helpful, um, at least as an opinion about how inspiration could work. That
sure.
perhaps Joseph sensed inspiration, but then he used the words and the symbols and the language and the theologies to which he attached during that day to express what he thought the impressions were. That would be a faithful reconciliation.
I think there's also a quote from Joseph Smith about, the spirit of revelation, how he talks about like pure intelligence flowing through you and sudden strokes of ideas and impressions, and that could be sort of a way to get into maybe how he interpreted or viewed revelation.
Yeah, and because at least in the beginning he only spoke one language, he probably perceived that the direct information was coming to him in English. Uh, where I always believed that's how it worked for me until I went on my mission and had to express it in a different language and realized that it didn't come to me in English.
Hmm. Right, yeah, we always have to sort of give meaning and clothe it in language and vocabulary.
Yeah. Yeah.
Okay.
So continuing, I would say that the actual text of the Book of Mormon gives us insight into the resources, uh, whether they were written resources or whether they were part of Joseph's creative memory that influenced his. Um, all right. So what I would say is the overwhelming intertextuality between the New Testament and the Book of Mormon text gives us insight into Joseph's depth of study and understanding in the Bible, which he studied in the years following his leg surgery. If you recall,
Yes.
I can't remember if it was typhoid. Anyway, he was sick and he almost lost his leg. And it just so happened because they were close to Dartmouth College, there was a doctor there that figured out a way to do a surgery on Joseph's leg without amputating it. You remember that story because
Yeah.
it gets proof texted and blended into the word of wisdom narrative,
Definitely
because
wouldn't even take the
he
wine or
wouldn't
whatever
take
was offered to him.
whiskey.
Whiskey,
Yeah.
that was what it was.
Yeah, it is whiskey or wine. Anyway, my understanding is that during that time when Joseph got really sick, it's possible that he had a near-death experience because he was so sick. And then he had the leg surgery, and then it took quite a while, I think more than a year, for him to recover from that surgery. And he would walk around, like with a cane and stuff like that. Um, and so, it seems to make sense that during the time that he was bedbound, um, and particularly if he was motivated by a near-death experience, he became very interested in religion, studied the Bible. And I understand that my understanding is Hiram attended an academy at Dartmouth College, and John Smith was one of the Dartmouth College professors that would give the sermons on Sunday on campus. And so it's quite possible that Hiram, having attended the academy, not really attending Dartmouth College, but attending the academy at Dartmouth College, that
Mhm.
Hiram likely would have attended more than 100 sermons of John Smith on Sundays, or I don't know if they did like Tuesday devotionals, like happens at BYU, but given on the campus. And so some critics would say that a lot of theologies in Mormonism seem to be predated or connect to John Smith's theologies, the professor at Dartmouth College, but they weren't quite sure where that connection came from. Like
Mhm.
how would Joseph end up with John Smith theologies? But
Yeah.
the the facts seem to be that Hiram attended the academy there. Hiram may have attended more than 100 sermons of John Smith. And then after Joseph's leg surgery, Hiram would have potentially been involved in the education of Joseph Smith. So um, as most people in Joseph's day, most people, is my understanding, were homeschooled. And Joseph didn't have a lot of formal education, but his parents were teachers. Hiram was educated at the academy at Dartmouth. They would have been involved in his education. And Joseph's near contemporary, Abraham Lincoln, also was homeschooled. Now, most people wouldn't say, oh, Abraham Lincoln was like some dummy and he had no education because he was homeschooled, right?
Right.
Uh, that would be a weird narrative for Abraham to attribute to Abraham Lincoln. But Joseph's education probably was similar to Abraham Lincoln in that there was a fair amount of homeschooling. Now, what we do know is that Joseph's spelling wasn't great, and he also spoke in the vernacular of his time. His accent probably was like a Vermont, or that upper part of the U.S. at the time vernacular. His accent was different than both yours and mine. It'd probably be interesting to hear what his accent sounded like. Um, but in any event, it seems clear that he was well read, and he was taught by his parents and Hiram, and he probably memorized passages of the King James Version of the Bible, as well as from the Apocrypha for educational as well as devotional purposes.
Mhm.
Um, and so in the video that I did, I linked, and I'll share the link with you so you can put it in the show notes. There's a website called tothink.org that has a page on it that talks about intertextuality between the King James Version of the Bible and the Book of Mormon, and goes through several different examples of that. That was my first
Yeah.
real exposure to the depth of intertextuality between New Testament texts and the Book of Mormon.
I
And
did
then,
a recent video on my channel on the New Testament and the Book of Mormon, and Grant Palmer has a chapter in his book, and yeah, it's
yes,
kind of undoubtable. There's some long quotations borrowing, like if you compare 1 Corinthians 13 and Moroni 7, or the gifts of the Spirit, with Moroni 10, and a lot of what Jesus says to the Nephites, and even small phrases throughout the Book of Mormon. Something that I've been doing as part of my Book of Mormon study is if I see a phrase that looks sort of, biblical. I look to see, and I write down the New Testament phrase, and there's actually quite a lot of them. Like, and you could say, it's interwoven beautifully part of the dictation. You could even say it's, inspired, however people want to interpret it. But yeah, it's unquestionable that there's a dependence on the New Testament, which, critics might say, well, that's anachronistic. That wouldn't have been on the brass plates, and people can interpret it what theory they want to postulate to that. But yes, I
Yeah.
do agree with
Yeah.
you.
Yeah. It absolutely is anachronistic. But it could be similar to using the phraseology as busy as a cat on a hot tin roof. In other words, Joseph had the vernacular from the New Testament, and so then
Sure.
he included that as he actualized or projected the text of the Book of Mormon.
Can I offer a wee pushback because I have Brian Hales in my head because we did an interview about Joseph's skills, and he would probably say that you had like his family members and his wife's saying that he wasn't very educated. I know there's a quote from Lucy Smith that he wasn't as interested in books as the other children, so he might push back on you. I think it's definitely clear from I think it's his 1832 account that he talks about, reading the Bible, studying it quite carefully for a couple of years, but him being sort of like this scholar who was really, or not scholar, but this kid who was really interested in loads of books, he might say, well, maybe there's not evidence, from his family members. What would be your just quick response to that?
I mean, my response to that is that's probably embellishment to dumb down his level of education and
Capability.
familiarity, because we have Doctrine and Covenants sections 10 uh, and D&C 7 that were given about that time, and he's narrating those you know in a way that is not dumbed down. And we also, Joseph Smith Papers Project is, there's a letter that he drafted or dictated that is well read or well worded. And so I would say a couple things. If you look at the printer's manuscript, or not the printer, if you look at the manuscript before the printer's
Like the
manuscript,
original one?
with mostly Oliver's writing, there's not a lot of punctuation, and
I think there's only
there,
what 20 something percent of that one as well as a 20 around 30%. I think they have of the original one. I think it's
yeah,
something.
it's not all of it, but there's enough of it to kind of see what's going on. And what seems to be going on is Joseph is speaking using King James language, but he is also using like a folksy vernacular of his day that's kind of mixed in, like we be a going to this place or something,
A
that
journeying or
yeah, a
like
journeying,
other,
that kind of thing.
yeah,
Yeah, yeah. And so um I mean, Joseph's in it because it has that folksy kind of stuff mixed in with the King James version.
yeah.
um and so I would say that this dumbing down of Joseph just doesn't make any sense to me, because we have sections of the Doctrine and Covenants, we have other things that Joseph did in around that time where it's clear that he could narrate or dictate a well worded letter. um and
So they might
and
argue, well, he could, but maybe with inspiration. But I know the letter you're pointing to, that wouldn't have been a
that wouldn't
revelation.
have been inspiration. Yeah.
Mhm.
Yeah. So uh I mean, what makes the most sense to me is if he uh was really creative, like, remember comedian Robin Williams, how creative
Mhm.
he was. So if Joseph really had, some ADD tendencies and some creativity, but then also at the same time, uh, he had a significant interest in religion. His grandfather was a very prominent Universalist, wrote a book about it. Religion was a significant topic of the day. There was a significant interest in folklore magic as well as secret knowledge in that day, like with Freemasonry and other kinds of things. um, Jewish mysticism. All those kinds of things were of great interest in that day. And if you combine that with, it's possible that Joseph had a near-death experience around the time he was sick with his leg, and the kind of education that he got at home from his parents in Hiram, it seems it seems to me that it it's likely that Joseph had the capacity to do a lot of what's in the Book of Mormon. It's true that there's a lot of complexity in the Book of Mormon, but the complexity of the Book of Mormon doesn't mean it's ancient. It just means that it's complex, right? So I
Gotcha.
like in the beginning of our discussion, I talked about experiencing spirit, and the meaning that I attributed to spirit was a reliable divine witness of truth. And then that, for me, that proved to be not reliable. But at the same time, that doesn't mean I didn't experience spirit. So if someone experienced spirit, that's a real thing. The question is, what do you attribute to it? If something is complex, that's a real thing. But what meaning do you attribute to that complexity? Does that have to mean that it's a historical, book written by ancient Americans? No, it
Yeah, no, that's
doesn't.
good enough. Yeah.
Those are totally two independent things as
Mhm.
to if something's complex versus it has to be historical.
Yeah.
um, Someone can experience spirit, they can be inspired, they can write things that move people and are meaningful to them, and not have it be pseudepigrapha. I mean,
Mhm.
that can happen.
Just a
So
wee question. Why do you postulate or speculate that he might have had a near-death experience as opposed to maybe a dream of Moroni, or maybe when he was 14 had like a born again experience? What because I know a believer and apologist might think, where are you sort of getting that sort of speculation, or is there any hints to that in any sources? Or is that just sort of your theory?
yeah, so you read the CS letter and letter to my wife and others that include the texts of theophanies, or first vision, tangentially related accounts from other people that were pretty common in
Hmm.
Joseph's day. And so I just think there was a magic world view. There was a view that dreams are something, that scrying is something, that they were living in an apocalyptic age, that the Bible was literal historical. And so I think it's very likely that Joseph, let me know if the lawnmower outside's too loud because I can
Oh no,
change.
I don't hear it.
Okay. So I think it's very likely that, and Dan Vogel suggests that Joseph probably had a born again experience, and then he attributed meaning to it, just like we attribute meanings to the experiences that we have. And that over time, the meaning that he attributed to those experiences were affected by his theological, philosophical, and rhetorical goals and concerns over time, which happens to us. Like, we'll have a memory in the past that over time, the meaning that we attribute to that memory shifts. And sometimes even the memory shifts based on what our experience and understanding of things are. And I think
Sure.
it's quite likely that at some point Joseph had some sort of one or more dreams, or had some sort of an experience where he believed that he was visited either spiritually or actually physically by an angel.
Mm.
Um, and I think over time, that changed and developed. I don't come down on the idea that it happened in 1820. I think from what I've read, there's a variety of reasons that I would suggest that it probably happened after Alvin died, and then over time, it became kind of a bigger and bigger thing, and then maybe split into two different stories: one of a visit of an ancient American, guardian angel of the plates, and one
Mm.
a visitation from Jesus that
Okay.
sound very similar to other theophanies of the day. And that over time, and as his theology evolved, then it was a visit of Jesus and God the Father
Gotcha.
over time.
Okay. Keep going
So,
with the Book of Mormon.
all right. So with the Book of Mormon, the next thing that I would say is, so how, from a devotional apologetic standpoint, given the evidence, how did Joseph do it? So I've alluded to this before, but I'll say I think the best apologetic reconciliations for how Joseph did it, while acknowledging the textual anachronisms and in the things that the text has that it shouldn't have, and the things that the text doesn't have that it should have, and given anachronisms, things like a completed Pentateuch, or the pseudepigraphic chapters of Isaiah that didn't exist before the exile to be on brass plates, even the existence of the idea of a biblical canon on brass plates, or the anachronistic New Testament texts, long ending of Mark, things like that, along with direct borrowing from themes and phrasing that was common to the 19th century sermons of Joseph's day, extant narratives like maybe Lehi's Joseph's father's dream being connected to Lehi's dream,
Mhm.
or other ideas of that day. I think, in spite with all of that, I think the most helpful apologetic reconciliations are Blake Ostler's expansion theory or
Yeah.
Mike Ash's co-authorship theory. They both acknowledge 19th century anachronisms, but they reconcile that Joseph's mind and paradigms were part of the translation or explanation process instead of Joseph being a sock puppet or
Mhm.
reading word for word off the stone. I don't think that's a helpful
I
reconciliation
think most scholars are
apologetically.
moving away from that. Some still believe that maybe words were transmitted to the stone, but it was maybe his translation is my I think, but I think most are moving towards Joseph being a co-participant and having to do intellectual work and clothing it in his language and vocabulary, which could account for 19th century elements if you're still a believer in the historicity.
Yeah, I mean the story is that there were Nephite interpreters, and also the brownstone, and that when the 116 pages thing happened, that the interpreters and the plates were taken away, and then afterwards the plates were returned, but not the Nephite interpreters. At least that's one
Yeah, because
narrative that
Emma
I've
and
read.
Martin both talk about that the Urim and Thummim or the spectacles weren't used again after the 116 pages, and it was
Yeah,
just the seer stone. But yeah, you alluded to the account of him swapping the stones. I know Blake Ostler interpreted that as him taking out one of the stones from the spectacles. Maybe it was that, but I think some scholars, like Stephen Smoot, says we don't know when it was just the spectacles or when it was the seer stone, and
yeah,
it, it's
yeah.
complex.
but but I think the more compelling evidence is after the 116 pages incident that it was the brownstone.
Don't tell that to
And
the Smith Foundation.
yeah, right. Yeah. And yeah, and they can tell that to President Nelson. Um uh because he's supposed to have discernment. So I would say that over time, Joseph continued to use his seer stones. Mike Quinn suggested that he used his white seer stone in the translation of the Book of Abraham. Um, and many of the revelations in the Doctrine and Covenants involve Joseph, accessing one of his multiple different seer stones. But toward the end, Joseph, I understand the narrative is that Joseph realized that he didn't need to use the stones anymore.
Hmm.
And so the way that I interpret that is that the stones actually never really mattered in the first place. They were more
Yeah, that's
uh,
a good point.
they weren't magical. They weren't, they were used as a focusing or scrying type device. But it'd be like someone uses a dowsing rod to find water so they can build a well. And then later on, they realize they don't need the dowsing rod anymore to find the
Right.
well.
Hmm.
And so in the end, the dowsing rod really didn't have any magical properties or divine properties to find the water. The person just used them until they realized they didn't need to use it anymore. And
Right.
so my sense of the interpreters, the narrative and the interpreters, or the narrative of the brown stone or the white stone. I think he had a green stone too. I understand maybe he had a red stone. the narrative of the stones uh, served a purpose for a period of time, but in the end, he realized that he just didn't really need them anymore, and so maybe they weren't magical in the first place. Is kind of my take.
Okay.
So on the apologetic side, I'd say I think the text gives us evidence of what Joseph did. D&C 9 gives us evidence of how Joseph may have perceived he did it, or at least Oliver perceived he did it that way, and the other witnesses perceived he did that way.
Hmm.
And so I think the Book of Mormon is very similar to other scriptures that are a form of pseudepigrapha. So similar to the letters falsely attributed to Paul, or the Pentateuch being attributed to Moses, or Second Isaiah being attributed to Isaiah, or the backdated prophecies in the Book of Daniel. Similar to other scriptures that are pseudepigrapha, that written in the name of another as a form of scripture. Those scriptures inspire people. The story of the woman taken in adultery inspires people, but that
Yeah.
doesn't mean that it's a literal historical story, and it doesn't mean that whoever authored the Gospel of John actually wrote that story, which he probably didn't. The nativity narrative in the book of Luke is considered by scholars to be a late addition, because it seems very poorly with what happens in the gospel attributed to Luke right after the nativity story, and it uses kind of different vocabulary, and
Hmm.
it's very contradictory to the Matthew nativity story. The two
Yes,
stories
they are very
couldn't
different.
have occurred within 11 years of each other, but still people, when they read the Luke story, I mean, when I read the Luke story, I experienced spirit in it, right?
Mhm. Yeah.
And so I think that is similar to uh, the Book of Mormon. So then I would say, could there have been divinity or God involved? And I would say, I don't know. Maybe. I'm kind of agnostic about it. The way I reconcile and attribute meaning to God or divine isn't the same as I used to, but I do sense that divinity exists and that humans experience it. And then what we have a tendency to do, like Pete Enns would suggest, is we attribute meaning to our experience with
Right.
divinity,
Yeah.
clothed in the language and the theologies that we have, rather than a top-down model. So I think it's likely that Joseph believed there was divinity in it. I think those around him, Emma, the witnesses, believed divinity was involved.
Yeah.
Um, I think that Joseph believed that the Book of Mormon brought people into the version of Christ that he believed in. And
Sure.
so, even though he was using deception, my sense is that he was using some level of performative deception. He probably felt justified because he probably felt spirit in it. And he felt like God wanted him to do it because it was bringing people into the version of Christ in which he believed. Um, uh, but if we were to talk with Joseph and say, were there really Nephites? And he was honest about it, I think that he would probably say, uh, no, there weren't Nephites, but it doesn't matter. I think that's what he would say, but that's just
You don't
pure.
think Joseph Smith historically believed in the historicity of the Book of Mormon? I was going to touch with you on the account from Lucy in her biography about Joseph Smith telling stories of the ancient inhabitants of the continent. And do you believe that this is when Joseph was sort of getting the ideas for the Book of Mormon, telling the stories, and this almost came before the oral dictation of the Book of Mormon? Obviously, to a believer, they might interpret it as he's getting that either through visions or through his experiences meeting with the angel Moroni, and that's what he's retelling to his family members. Obviously, to a naturalist who doesn't believe in, an angel and gold plates in a historical Book of
Uh,
Mormon, you would probably interpret it as he's practicing his stories.
so I think it's hard to say, because that Lucy's account is a late account. And so maybe she was imputing memory to experiences and embellishing them to be more than
Yeah,
they actually were. I don't
that's
know.
true. Yeah, fair
But I
point.
do, but I do think it's clear that the mound builder myths of Joseph's day were pretty ubiquitous. Like there was a common belief that there were non dark-skinned people who built the mounds, and
Yeah.
that they were killed off by
Savage
the
Indians.
yeah, the ancestors of the indigenous peoples. And so I think Joseph was creative enough that he very well may have riffed off of those ideas and stories of the day. Does that mean that he took several years to develop the story of what would become the Book of Mormon? I mean, it's possible, but I think that's just speculation. The same, because we don't
Right.
have notes anywhere.
Yes.
Uh, so I think he probably did tell stories. Were they exactly what Lucy suggests? It's hard to say because it's such a
Because you
late
think they
account.
might be a bit maybe skeptical, like, oh, those are the same stories you told us, maybe. What do you think of when critics, some critics would point to, and I don't think these are, good scholarly critics would say that there's much validity to these, but the phrasing, similar phrases or parallels to things in like the late war, the view of the Hebrews, if not a source or plagiarism, perhaps an influence. Like the first book of Napoleon. What do you think of those? Do you think they had an influence on the Book of Mormon?
Um, if they didn't have a direct influence, they probably had an ancillary influence, because that kind of rhetoric and language of parsing things in King James Version language seems to have been common for the day.
The
So
religious language of the day.
yeah, and the use of the idea, the late war, is the War of 1812, expressed in King James Version language, right?
Hmm.
Uh, and so whether or not Joseph had that text as one of his textbooks for his homeschooling, or whether he checked it out from the Palmyra library or not, um, I don't know that it necessarily matters. I think what's clear is this idea of literal historicity of the Pentateuch, that there was a global flood, that there were Tower of Babel, and that Indians were descendants of a lost tribe of Israel, and things like that were ubiquitous for the day. And so whether or not he borrowed those ideas from those texts, or whether those are just among the milieu of what was commonly understood or believed at that day, it could be either one.
Right. Yeah. Okay.
So I think when people read uh, the CS letter, and they read that part of it, and they see some of the uh, matching of phrases, or they look at the Holly maps where
Mhm.
there were names of cities and townships in the area that correspond with names that show up in the Book of Mormon. um, I think initially a lot of people, when they read the CS letter, think, oh, Joseph was totally just copying it.
That's
uh,
what I thought when I first read it. It was one of the, like, I thought the view of the Hebrews was probably, and there are parallels that you can definitely see in
yeah,
the story. There's some parallels, about it's the 10 lost tribes traveling over to the Americas. There's a white race and a dark race. There's warfare, building cities, quoting Isaiah. There's a Christ figure. What's it? Quetzalcoatl. I can't even say his
yeah,
name right.
Quetzalcoatl, yeah.
And you could say possibly an influence. I think Dan Vogel's view would be both books probably came out of the mound builder myth, and all those things going around in the milieu, and like the late war book of Napoleon, there's some between some of the ellipses, some pages between, and
Sure.
it's most likely the similarities because it's similar King James Bible language that both are using in those texts. I didn't find them super persuasive for this explains the Book of Mormon to me.
Yeah, yeah, so I would compare it to the movie Star Wars. So uh Star Wars has narratives in it that are pre-existing ideas and narratives, about space, about long ago. Joseph Campbell talks about the story of the hero's journey, which is Luke Skywalker's story, and so forth. And so some people might look at the movie Star Wars and then look at other films and books of its day and say, oh, that they were just copying, all these other movies and stories and things like that, and could there be an element to that? Maybe, but I think more likely is that what was in the milieu were the components of the story that became the movie Star Wars in the
Hmm.
series. And I think that that is similar when you talk about the late war and the first book of Napoleon and view of the Hebrews and the mound builder myths. I think it's more likely that it was in the milieu, and whether or not Joseph read those books uh, isn't a critical factor in determining how the stories in the Book of Mormon came to be, in my
Yeah.
view.
Okay. No, I totally resonate with that. Is there anything else you want to say about the composition of the Book of Mormon? Anything for you why you lean towards the Book of Mormon not being historical text? You kind of like talked about that because I might say like why not just view it more of as a loose translation or you said that you thought Blake Ostler, Michael Ash's view of it being maybe an expansion or Joseph being a co-author.
Yeah.
Why for you would you not go that route and not see the Book of Mormon as historical?
Yeah, so I mean that's a great question. What I would say is we started this conversation with me sharing four things about biblical scholarship,
Yeah,
and 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 that is the framework through which I look at the Book of Mormon.
gotcha. Yeah,
And so when I look at the framework of biblical scholarship, um, how the Book of Mormon came to be, I mean, it's interesting. The Book of Mormon text is interesting, but that doesn't change the message and the theology of the text. I mean, it doesn't change that there's backdated prophecies in it. It doesn't change that it's founded on the literal historicity of the stories and characters of the Pentateuch. It doesn't change that it's based on 19th century theology that was in Joseph milieu, and that the prophecies in the Book of Mormon that are post 1829 are either false prophecies, in my view, or they're very generalistic prophecies that would apply to any time and place. And so I look at the Book of the Mormon the same way I look at the text of the Book of Hebrews in the Bible. It's not authored by Paul. It probably does not represent what existed at the time Jesus lived or shortly thereafter. Um, but it's a valuable scriptural text and it's worth reading. And the
yeah,
book of Daniel is a valuable scriptural text. It's worth reading, even though it's a backdated prophecy about stuff that had already happened, you know. But it becomes interesting. Like the story of the woman taken in adultery is a late addition. And for people that really understand it, the Jews used to have festivals that related to when the harvests happened. And there was a festival that related to some scriptures in Jeremiah about if the people didn't do what Yahweh wanted them to do, that their names wouldn't be worth what's written in the dust. And that would be a scripture that would have been read around when that festival is. And so the Jews would get together in these festivals and they'd be intense and they would drink wine and probably commit adultery and other kinds of things like that. And the story of the women taken in adultery is these men catch this woman in the act of adultery. Uh, they take her to Jesus, not the man, but they take her to Jesus.
yeah. That's pretty sexist, isn't it?
Yeah, and they say, the law says we're supposed to stone them, and most likely they were being hypocritical because they were involved in the festival, probably doing the same thing, that they caught her doing. And then in the story, Jesus listens to what they say, and then he kind of kneels down and he starts to write with his finger in the dust.
That's right. Yeah,
And the connection to the scripture with regard to Jeremiah for someone that understood that, they would go, oh, Jesus was writing their names in the dust as a
Mm.
fulfillment of the scripture saying he was Yahweh writing their names in the dust.
Mm.
And so it's a beautiful story, right? And with that extra context of linking it to the Jewish festivals and, the text of the Hebrew Bible, like, it's a very meaningful, deeply valuable text, I think.
Yeah.
There's
Mhm.
multiple layers of it, but that doesn't mean that it ever happened. And it doesn't mean it's literally historical. And the way I see the Book of Mormon is like that.
I resonate with that because a lot of the most profound parts of, for me, the New Testament are often the parables that Jesus taught, and while they're not historical, or the people in the parables are real, it's the spiritual meaning behind it. Now, I did want to ask you a couple of questions before you sort of share how you view the Book of Mormon. You've kind of alluded to it, but a couple of
Sure.
apologetics things is, and I think I already know your answer, but I'm gonna ask it anyway.
Sure.
They would point to things that maybe, like, the complex chiasmus or Hebraisms, or the complexity of the text, the internal consistent geography and all the characters and plot lines and sermons, and how this just seems like it's such a sophisticated text. And they might say, like, there's, in the Book of Ether, where it talks about like 20 or 30 kings, and then he has them all listed, and then he talks about each one in like reverse order. And like, this just seems like a really extraordinary work to be able to orally dictate this text as like a 23, 24-year-old farm boy who's never written a novel before. And they would point maybe things in old world geography, Nahum Bountiful, to support, like, why for you are those things not compelling to support it being sort of authentic or historical? I think you probably would acknowledge maybe the complexity in some of those sophisticated things in the Book of Mormon. But why for you do you not find those apologetics compelling?
Yeah. So the Book of Ether is based on the etiological myth of there being a single Adamic language, a tower, and a confounding of languages. And when we study world history and biblical scholarship, what we learn is that etiological myth didn't exist in 2300 BCE when the brother of Jared is paced in time. It probably didn't exist until maybe the 7th century BCE is when that etiological myth was developed. And so, but Joseph was coming from a framework that the Bible was little history, so it made sense for him to include the Tower of Babel story in the Book of Ether. So, but the problem is not only is this ideological myth placed as literal historical for the brother of Jared, it's not only a problem for that, it's a problem because the Nephite interpreters are said to have origined the the
Of the
stones.
stones, the
Yeah,
16 stones that the Lord touched.
yeah, in that origin myth. And uh, and King Mosiah is said to use those stones, right, to be able to translate
Hmm.
from the 24 Jaredite gold plates. And Moroni does it also, is the story. And then there's the story that these origin myth oriented from the Tower of Babel ideological myth Nephite interpreters are then used by Moroni to write the 2/3 sealed portion uh, on the plates, which is supposed to contain the grand revelation of the brother of Jared. And, uh, it would be really, really long because, like, if the Book of Mormon is 500 pages and then there's 116 pages, that's 600 pages. That means the 2/3 sealed portion would
At least
be
1,200
at
with my
least
math.
1,200 equivalent English pages. And so there are some people, like I heard, Blake say, yeah, of course, the Tower of Babel is an ideological myth or an origin story.
Yeah, it's funny because I've just been learning about sort of like these implications with biblical scholarship, and kind of like from the LDS discussion series in the past year and the implications for
Yeah.
the Book of Mormon. I'm like, oh, flip, like this is because biblical scholarship was not part of my first faith crisis. It was something I
Yeah.
never looked into. I was like, oh, this is kind of problematic. And then as I've asked certain scholars about it, they're like, oh yeah, of course the Tower of Babel is not a literal historical event. Like, how
Yeah.
silly of you,
Yeah.
to think
Yeah.
that. And I'm like,
Yeah.
oh, okay, like that's a shift for me. I was going to bring up like the quick apologetic that I think maybe Stephen Smoot or I think I heard Patrick Mason says, okay, maybe there wasn't a literal Tower of Babel that happened, and the Jaredites coming from the Tower of Babel, but perhaps this was because it was Ether who wrote, the Book of Ether, and then it was translated by Mosiah, and then Mormon and Moroni redacted it, and perhaps there's this myth that they carried with them, Lehi and his family as they traveled over the Promised Land, and it was Mormon or Moroni sort of attributing it in their redaction back to the Jaredites, that this is where they came from. I understand that you could say, well, it's just a lot of stretching. Have you heard that sort of apologetic? I've not really researched many good apologetics
Yeah.
addressing that specific issue.
Yeah. Um, I mean, it's not only the implications that maybe Mormon believed it, because supposedly there was a Bible in the brass plates that had it on there, right? But we know from biblical scholarship that the five books of Moses didn't exist pre-exilic. Um, and so could there have been, some text that suggested the Tower of Babel ideological myth prior to uh, the exile? I mean, it's possible, but the
I know Stephen
implications,
Smoot pointed out to me, he said, oh, the Tower of Babel, although that's the way we've all interpreted it, he says it just refers to the Great Tower, not the
yeah,
Tower in the Book of
there
Mormon.
could
And he is right. I did check that, and he was right.
there could be two towers like there's two Comoras, right? Uh, but
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 yeah.
the implications for that ideological myth aren't just for the Nephite interpreters, for Moroni, for Mosiah, and for Joseph Smith using the interpreters, as well as the story in the Book of Ether and the Brethren Jared. It also has implications for the 2/3 sealed portion as well. So then you're dealing with a degree of fungibility that the 2/3 sealed portion is like the equivalent of more than 1,200 pages of English text that was written down, that's based on the Tower of Babel origin myth.
Mhm.
Like it just becomes so much that it's just a lot easier to go back to what I expressed with the four things that I explained about biblical scholarship, is that Joseph was coming from a framework where he believed that the Pentateuch was a literal historical uh, story about literal historical people, and that there actually was a single Adamic language, and there actually was a confounding of languages and a tower and so forth. And Joseph imputed that into the story, which is an expansion. Blake Ostler, I don't know if he would say it's an expansionist theory, but I would say it's an expansionist theory
Mm.
with related to Joseph, not not Ether, not Mosiah, not
Yeah, kind of like
Moroni,
Midrash or yeah,
but
co-author his own
but
expansion or
but Joseph's expression of that. But for me, the Tower of Babel is one of the foundations to rejecting historicity, because if you take out any sort of reliability, the 2/3 seal portion, or the idea of the Nephite interpreters or the Book of Ether have to it. I don't know what that does. To me, I haven't been able to reconcile the idea that the implications of the 2/3 seal portion, the Book of Ether, and the Nephite interpreters being midrash or expansion,
Mhm.
while retaining literal historicity of the other things. I mean, there are other problems in the Book of Ether, like for the period of time that it covers, the generations are too far apart. Like people don't have kids once every like 50 years or something like that. people have kids, every 20 years or less, right? And so there aren't enough generations in the Book of Ether, for example. So in any event, going back to your question, what I would say is,
I suppose you would
if,
probably, if I'm steel manning, you would probably point to that, there's things maybe with biblical scholarship. We talk about like, the Tower of Babel myth and, Deutero, Isaiah, maybe anachronisms and things. And you might feel like, though, to you, maybe outweigh some of the complexity or the evidence that apologists point to. Would that be fair?
uh, so I don't disagree with complexity. So I would bring up another example. So biblical scholars would explain the narrative of the house of Israel and the 12 tribes and the lost 10 tribes is also an ideological myth, that there were origin stories of the tribe of Judah. There were origin stories of the different Israelite tribes, of which there were more than 10, but the book only has 10. That around the time of the exile, that a narrative of a common ancestor of Abraham, a common ancestor of Jacob, but interestingly also Israel, trying to merge multiple different people in their histories into a single narrative about common ancestors, and the idea of a literal historical exodus and all those kinds of things. So what biblical scholars would probably tell you is the narrative of the 10 tribes, the lost 10 tribes, and this gathering of Israel has no basis in idea of intending to be a literal direct prophecy about something that was yet to have happened in 1829. Rather, it is also a ideological myth at the level, pretty much at the level of the Exodus ideological myth, or the global flood ideological myth, or the Tower of Babel ideological myth. So when I study biblical scholarship and I see all those things and how biblical scholars look at that, another one would be biblical scholars would tell you that the idea of Satan as an individual adversary uh, to God wasn't a theology that was developed until long after the Greco-Roman period, long after the Babylonian exile. But the Book of Mormon has, the devil as not, an executioner or among the pantheon of gods, but actually has Greco-Roman and later attribution of meaning to the devil, for example. So it's thing after thing after thing that when I look at the biblical scholarship, I'm like, it didn't exist. Like the idea of a single devil adversary didn't exist. The idea of the house of Israel and the 12 tribes and the gathering of the 10 tribes is like at the level of the global flood
Mm.
origin myth. And so what I would say is is when I look at world history, when I look at biblical scholarship, when I look at those things that I expressed to you, the text stands by itself in that I would say that it's not, it doesn't work for it to be literal history about literal historical people. But at the same standpoint, I would say that I agree with apologists where there are portions of the text that are pretty complex. And I agree that, while there are some mistakes, like, there's one that critics point out of Benjamin dying and then not dying or something like
Oh yeah,
that.
Benjamin Isaiah. Yeah.
Yeah, those kinds of things. I mean, there are some of those kinds of problems in the text, but overall, the text actually is a pretty, I consider it scripture, just like I consider the book of Hebrews scripture. So I'd go back to what I mentioned before is the level of complexity of the Book of Mormon is it's a completely separate question as to whether it's literally historical.
Historicity. Right. Yeah.
Yeah, it could be very, very complex. You could feel and experience spirit in it, but that doesn't mean the story of the woman taken in adultery is a literal historical story. Uh, or, that doesn't mean that the story of the Good Samaritan is a literal story. an account of something that happened. What it means is that people read things and they experience spirit in it, and they read things and they notice complexity in it, and what you're evaluating is it complex, and that's a completely different question as to whether it's historical. And to me, the anachronisms and the foundational reliance on the literal historicity of pre and post exilic texts, uh, just for me, it makes it non-historical, but it's
Okay.
still interesting to me. Now Blake talks about uh, Hebrew legalistic, uh, presenting a case, and he talks about
That's like the ancient
Hebraisms and
lawsuits and
yeah, and things like that, and
covenant renewal
covenant
festivals,
renewal
things like that.
festivals, things like that. Yeah, and so I haven't, I've read his stuff, and I haven't gone very much more into depth in that. But my sense is that if I went into depth in that, that either some of those things could be a parallel of what existed in 19th century, uh, with revivalist meetings, being similar to a covenant renewal.
Like
Um,
King Benjamin's speech, because I know
yeah,
Blake sort of said that Joseph probably in his mind, probably saw it similar to like a revivalist preacher, but then yeah, he
yeah,
was saying like it has sort of ancient sort of origin or antiquity to it, like the covenant renewal in ancient Israel. But yes, I know what you
yeah.
mean.
Yeah, and chiasmus, they exist in the Bible. They exist in the late war. They exist in the Doctrine and Covenants. Yes,
Yeah,
there's some pretty amazing chiasmus in the Book of
Alma
Mormon.
36 is a child.
Yeah,
Beautiful. It's
yeah,
amazing that he was able to
yeah,
not just write but orally dictate
yeah.
it. Like
But yeah, but to me, that doesn't make it historical. That just means that he was able to do something that was really complex.
mhm.
And also in looking at the history is that kind of rhetorical device existed in the day. Shakespeare uses chiasms and Hebraisms in Shakespeare's plays. And one source, whether it's direct or indirect, um, is uh, what's the text for Milton's Paradise Lost? Was an epic poem that was written long before Joseph, then transferred into English. And there are theologies in Milton's Paradise Lost that make it into the Book of Mormon, right? And there's rhetorical expressions in Paradise Lost that I think at least have parallels to what's in the Book of Mormon. So when I hear the apologists like Blake talk about these different things, without doing this, first of all, without doing the study to see, are these parallels to things that already existed in Joseph's day? Like, do they show up in Shakespeare? Not
Mm,
saying that Joseph was proficient in Shakespeare, but was it in the milieu of his day to use that as a rhetorical device, to communicate? Or the theologies of a fortunate fall in Milton's Paradise Lost. It seems like those kinds of things and others were extant in Joseph's day. So whether he was directly borrowing or whether that was, part of the things that he put in there, when those things show up, that is a question of complexity for me, not a question of literal historicity.
right. Gotcha. And I think just closing off, would you like to share sort of like the goodness or the beauty or the meaning, maybe any spiritual value you still see in the Book of Mormon as someone who doesn't, believe it's historical? I would say you probably don't believe in the, angel, gold plates, that element, but it sounds like you still are open to the possibility of maybe God was involved. Maybe there's inspiration. I think you lean towards that Joseph probably believed he was inspired, but, maybe used deception at times. We won't get into the witnesses and the gold plates because that's a
Sure.
whole
Yeah.
other discussion. But because I think it's very common for a lot of people that deconstruct the Book of Mormon, no longer believing its truth claims, just kind of like throw it out. And some people believe that, he just you just made it all up, and there's no spiritual value to it if it's not historical. Share just your final thoughts on the Book of Mormon.
Yeah, I mean, that to me, that's like saying that the letters falsely attributed to Paul have no value in understanding Christianity, you know, uh, or that the stories in the Pentateuch, because their origin stories, their ideological myths, have no value in understanding how Abrahamic religions and Christianity adopted those symbols and experienced spirituality and some of those things, even though I don't believe those are little historical stories. So it's true that some people go, well, if Moses is a literary character in an origin myth, then I'm just going to disregard any of that. And what
Yes.
and and they can do that. That's their choice. But for me, those origin stories, those ideological myths, and the texts that affected generation after generation over hundreds and thousands of years, number one, they they informed the the mythos and the moral frameworks of humanity. Also, uh, they were very important to the identity of different peoples. And also, I believe people experience, some people sometimes experience spirit with those texts. And so for me, they have value and they're very interesting to me. And biblical scholarship is interesting to me. And the Book of Mormon is interesting to me, even though, just like I don't believe the story of the woman taken in adultery is literally historical, I don't believe the Book of Mormon is about literal historical people. Now, there's significant things in the Book of Mormon that, were very and still are very, very meaningful to me, like the story of Nephi, uh, pleading with God for his people and tears wetting his pillow. I don't know if they had pillows back then, but tears wetting his pillow, as he was in Second Nephi, for his
Yeah.
people, or concerns about salvation, or ideas of, you know, Alma 32 with regard to the development of faith. I mean, theologically, that's very interesting to me. Or the Zoramite prayer, and then the reaction to the Zoramite prayer, like people getting up in fast and testimony meeting and saying, we're the greatest, America is the greatest, we're so grateful God has blessed us, and all this stuff and everything like that. And then you poor people over in Ireland going, Alma and Amulek, can't we worship God? Aren't we chosen to? Kind of
Yeah.
thing. I mean, I'm trying to be a little bit sarcastic, but the idea of the level of pride when people believe that they are chosen and favored above all other people, that it
Yeah.
gets expressed in the Zoramite prayer, or the expressions in the Book of Mormon with regard to poverty and classes and things like that. Those are all very meaningful things to me. They inform my perception of what was happening in the world in the 19th century, and
Yeah.
things like learning that when Joseph narrated, "It is by grace we saved after all we can do," that his theology at the time was despite all we can do. Like,
Hmm.
you know, and as I've studied biblical scholarship, and spent a lot more time in the Bible post faith crisis, the messages of grace uh, are just extremely powerful to me.
Yeah.
This the workers in the vineyard story, uh, the different messages of grace. It helps. I think it helps inform how I choose to extend grace to other people too.
Yeah.
And so I'm grateful for the church. It was a super important part of my life. I'm grateful for the Book of Mormon and what it did in my life. I don't believe in the truth claims in terms of authority, or the more literalistic orthodox things, but I experienced spirit in my life. I experienced spirit in the church, and I experienced spirit with texts that I don't believe are literally historical.
Hmm. That's beautiful. It kind of reminds me of whenever I listened to David Bokfoy's interview, and he talked about the beautiful messages in the Book of Mormon and the things which are inspiring about it, because it can be very tempting when people, lose their faith in history or the truth claims to just, throw it out that it's all just fraud, made up. And as I've been going through reading it again, um, even if you don't believe in, its historicity or there was a Nephi, and this is Joseph Smith attributing, himself to them. It seemed very apparent to me that he's very concerned about people's salvation, bringing them to Christ, promoting love, like helping the poor. Like there's so many beautiful messages in it. Like when Jesus comes and visits the Nephites and how they became united and there wasn't contention and division among the people, and you know the anti-Nephi Lehis and overcoming war and division through, peace. And there's so many just beautiful messages in the Book of Mormon. I
Yeah.
think it's great that you still find spiritual value and beauty in it.
I mean, the
And
context of his day, I mean, think of what the United States was like after the Revolutionary War, what that did to the country, after the War of 1812, with all the mess that was going on before there was an organized government and all that kind of stuff. And people living in that day holding an apocalyptic view that the second coming was at hand, right? In the midst of all of this, with the mound builder myths and concern about salvation and the anti-Masonic and the or the anti-secret combinations and the anti-Catholic narratives, like with infant baptism and stuff like that.
mhm,
The Book of Mormon comes out at that time and expresses the theologies and concerns. This is my view of
of the
that
19th
Joseph
century.
held at that time, and and to me it's pretty amazing. And yeah, there's complexity in it, and to me, I have experienced and continue to experience spiritual value in it, even though I don't believe there were Nephites, or that there's a literal gathering of the house of Israel. I believe that the witnesses really believed that um, the plates were ancient, although none of them had the capacity to determine whether they were ancient, right?
Sure. Yeah.
They couldn't read what would have been etched on them.
Hmm.
Um, and I believe that it's most likely that Oliver believed that what happened came from God. Uh, and
Yeah.
then I think Emma probably believed that too. Um, and on the three witnesses side, I think they probably believed that the plates were authentic, but at the same time, I they share different accounts that conflict in details. And in the history of the church, Martin Harris's experience was separate from the other two, if you recall.
That's right. Yeah.
Um, and because of the conflicting details, uh, the 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 way that I view the three witnesses is that it wasn't a visitation of an angel experience. It was more of a spiritual or mystical experience, maybe a guided experience, like in the Doctrine and Covenants, where Joseph Smith kind of leads Sidney Rigdon through a revelation of seeing Jesus.
Yeah. And DNC 76 of the Kingdoms of Glory. I
Yeah.
think that'll be Dan's sort of view or interpretation of what might have happened with the witnesses as well.
I think, yeah. So I don't think it was delusion or hypnosis. I think it was probably more of a guided mystical experience of people that had a magic worldview, but that the witnesses all believed that the device of the plates uh, were ancient, and that the Book of Mormon came from a divine source.
Hmm. I could see some ex-Mormon listening to you being like, "What do you mean? You feel spirit from it?" Like that, they might say like, that's just elevation emotion, or you just feeling like free and euphoria. Can you explain like what you mean by that? It sounds to me like you still leave room to some sort of divine, whether that be God or whatever it is, but there's some spiritual value you receive from it.
Yeah, I mean, I think a lot of the things that members of the church experience, to which they attribute the meaning of spirit probably is elevation emotion, where we perceive, participate in, witness acts of remarkable moral goodness. And the way that we are developed as human beings is that when we participate in those things, we experience an increase of dopamine in our system, which results kind of in a warmth in our core, increases our charitable disposition, our tolerance for others, maybe even it enlightens our mind a little bit because there's more brain activity going on with all of that. And I think a lot of what we human beings needed this, for us to not be all warlike all the time. I think it was probably part of our evolutionary process. But I think in the church, a lot of times when we experience elevation emotion, uh, and in Moroni's promise, I mean, it's an elevation emotion language, isn't it? I exhort you when you read these things that you would remember the remarkable moral goodness of God to people, right? Remember how
How
merciful God has
merciful God has been. Yeah.
yeah, and then pray and ask in your heart with sincere faith if these things are not true. To me, that language corresponds with pondering, considering, reading,
Yeah.
really sitting with, contemplating remarkable moral goodness, and that would correspond with an elevation emotion experience of experiencing dopamine and things like that. So I think a lot of what we experience in the church probably is elevation emotion, to which leaders and members tend to attribute meaning as spirit. And at the same time, there are things that we experience that I would refer to as transcendent moments, uh, that might be more than that.
Yeah. That
So
seem beyond just naturalistic explanations in some way.
it seems like that. Like in my TED talk, I share the story of me praying to know whether my mission was a worthy offering to God, and I felt like I received an answer from God, almost as audible words, that for me the purpose of my life is to live with gratitude for the opportunity to participate in the lives of others, and that whether or not my mission was an acceptable offering is really about me,
Mm.
more of an egocentric thing rather than about God and others. And so I don't know where that came from. That was a transcendent experience. It still informs my life today, even
Yeah.
not believing the church is true, or not believing the church is what it represents itself to be. I strive to live my life with gratitude for the opportunity to participate in the lives of others. And so when I use the word spirit, I'm basically saying that it could be elevation emotion, it could be transcendent experiences, it could be something larger. Uh, when I speak with a believer and they ask me about the meaning that I attribute to God, what I often will say is, in the Book of Mormon, it talks about the light of Christ. The
Mhm.
light of Christ is an omnipresent force that exists and manifests in and through all things, that it was part of the creative process and that informs our conscience, right?
And it
Something
like
like that.
sort of like invites and entices
Invites and
to do good,
entices. Yeah.
love
And
others.
so, yeah, so I would say when people ask me the meaning that I attribute to God, I would say, think of the light of Christ and stop there. I find it helpful to believe that there is an omnipresent, animating divine force that exists and manifests in and through all things. And since it's omnipresent, we're a part of it. So I would say God is in you, God is in me. Um, and as we seek to live with less dysfunction in our lives, as we become more aware and conscious, uh, we have an increased propensity to recognize the divinity that exists within us.
Mm.
Um, and so that's very different than an atonement theology, the idea that we're separated from God. My idea is divinity is omnipresent, so we're never separated from God. We just live with sufficient dysfunction that we don't recognize that divinity is already part of us.
Mm.
And so uh, so that is, this kind of conceptualization for divinity is often referred to as pantheism or panentheism. So Eckhart Tolle talks about God in a way that's kind of pantheist or panentheist, and Richard Rohr does too, and people like Rob Bell, Rachel Held Evans, and others talk about God kind of the way that I'm referring to it here, and that's kind of where I've landed. I'm a hopeful agnostic. I live my life as if I believed that a lot of the principles taught by the Jesus of the gospel were true, and I find meaning in that, and I experience spirit in it. And when I say spirit, it could be elevation emotion, or it could be transcendent things. It doesn't matter to me. I like it. I just want to do more of it.
I love it. Well, this has been Anthony, I think, a great discussion. You talking about your faith journey, and this really good in depth discussion on your view and your theory of how the Book of Mormon could have been composed. And I've appreciated your thoughtfulness and engaging with the history and the scholarship, and also your humility. And I think your open-mindedness as well. I've appreciated that, the kindness and fairness you've showed to the apologetics as well. And we're going to continue. I think we're going to stop here for part one. And part two, we're going to talk a little bit about sort of reconstructing and navigating mixed faith marriages and relationships. And maybe we could touch a little bit on like dialogue between former members and current members, and what we could do better, and critics and apologists. And we'll talk about that in part two. So make sure you come back for part two. But thank you so much for your time, Anthony, and for the work you do. And everyone check out his YouTube channel. It's Life After Deconstruction.
Yes.
That's right. Awesome. And I'll put links in the description where you can watch his video on the Book of Mormon, and also some of his interviews as well, and his TED Talk. And we'll see you back for part two. If you've enjoyed this, please like, share, and subscribe to my channel, Mormonism with the Murph. And I'll see you next time. Thanks everyone for watching this episode. If you've enjoyed it, please give it a like, share it with others who might benefit, and don't forget to subscribe so you don't miss any future content. You can also listen to these episodes on podcast form on Anchor or Spotify, and you can follow me on Facebook, Instagram, and TikTok. Check out my website for more content, personal blog, and more. And if you care to donate to support me, you can via my PayPal or Patreon, or through the website. And you can also give donations via YouTube through Super Chats. Thanks for watching Mormonism with the Murph. Take care. Bye-bye.